Fog grips Arlington like a living thing swallowing the rows of white headstones until the world becomes only marble breath in the slow metronome click of boots on stone. Private Ethan Cole. New to the old guard, steady as a held breath walks his 21 measured steps at 2:03 a.m. when the mist parts and a soldier in an antique uniform stares back at him from beyond the chains. Hollow eyes, mud-dark wool. A hand rises not in threat but in summons, and then the figure dissolves. Protocol says, do not flinch. Duty says, do not speak. But the dead have their own orders. Follow this story to the end and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this name travels. They taught him that the mat comes first. Before rank, before weather, before thought, the black mat at the tomb is the country's quiet heartbeat, and the guard keeps time. On his first midnight rotation, Private Ethan Cole held that rhythm with the fierce devotion of a man still learning how to trust his own feet. He had pressed his gloves so white they almost glowed shaved twice for a shave that needed no second pass, and polished his shoes until the floodlights threw back 2 perfect moons. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. High above the monument, a thin wash of cloud dulled the stars, and down low a milk-white fog drifted in from the river, curling through the cedars and along the paths as if the earth itself were exhaling. Ethan counted out the silence the way the manual taught: 21 paces, heel to toe, turn 21 seconds, turn, and again. He kept his eyes canted, just so forward-focused, never searching, never letting the perimeter own him. The rifle on his shoulder was weight and memory. He didn't think of it as a weapon. He thought of it as a promise. He had wanted this watch long before the recruiter's office and the long flat miles of basics, when other kids on his Ohio street were memorizing batting averages. Ethan was memorizing the cadence call of the old guard, listening to a grainy video on repeat until the words felt older than he was. His grandfather, George Cole Navy in Vietnam, had a way of talking about silence, like it was a place you could stand and honor, like it was something you could pick up off the ground and carry if you were strong enough. The first time Ethan visited Arlington as a boy, he'd seen the sentinels pause at the heel line and felt his chest go tight, as if he'd stumbled into church without knowing where the doors were. He decided then and there that if he could, he would learn the map of this silence. Now he knew it: how the marble gives back the sound of a boot the way a drum gives back a hand, how the air changes between midnight and 2, how even the birds seem to cede that quarter hour before dawn to the dead. He knew where the wind liked to come in across the hill, and how the breath inside his mask of a face couldn't fog the lenses of his bearing. And still something inside tonight was off by a fraction, as if someone had slid a nickel under one leg of the table. At 1:57 he noticed the fog lifting in a line that didn't match the breeze. Not a ripple. A parting. His jaw set. He did not alter pace. That was temptation, and temptation was not in the book. At 2:00 exactly, the floodlights hummed a little louder, the way old lights do when the voltage leans on them. At 2:03, between his turn and his 21 seconds at the heel line, something moved beyond the chain. It didn't lunge. It didn't even step. It appeared the way a photograph appears in a tray of developer. The outlines first, then the darker parts washing in. A soldier. Not in modern dress greens, but in a rough woolen tunic that ended too high at the thigh breeches, bloused into leggings, puttees wrapped with a patience born of habit, a cap that sat low and mean. A doughboy uniform, the kind he'd seen on museum mannequins, and in black and white shots of boys with eyes too old. The face was young and pale and cut by shadows. The eyes were not empty. Hollow, yes, but burning. Ethan's breath hitched just once. He smoothed it away. He did what they trained into his bones. He let his gaze pass through the figure, like light through smoke, and he finished his count. 21 seconds. Turn. The black of the mat steadied him. He dropped his weight into his hips for the return walk, and the click of his heels on the edge of the tile sounded like a metronome in a room that had forgotten music. He kept the figure in his periphery and refused to give it a fraction more. He would not break bearing for a drunk, a prank, a shadow, or a trick of the fog. But his heart was a drum that didn't care about manuals. It hammered so hard he could feel it in the braces of his molars. One more length, one more heel line. He allowed himself only what the creed allowed: awareness without acknowledgement. When he reached the turn, he gave the measured pause and let his eyes slide a hair, a fraction, a breath. Empty air. Fog shouldered the space again like a curtain pulled across a stage. The chain on its low post was just a dark rope with dew beating on it. No footprints. No sound. No shift of branch or leaf to say a body had been there at all. He waited out the count. He told his blood to sit down and be quiet. He walked. On minute 40, a fox ghosted across the upper path, red as a lit match where the floodlights caught him. On minute 53, a wind came from the river, bringing the smell of wet stone and old leaves. At minute 62, the floodlights buzzed and settled. Nothing else came to claim the edge of his vision. The motion he'd seen was the only wrong note in an hour, otherwise so perfect his instructors would have signed it. When the relief formed at the edge of the plaza, the gentle thud and lace of leather as the next sentinel came up with his NCO. Ethan felt the minute loosening he allowed himself at transfer. The inspection of the rifle was clean as a whistle. Steel on steel, wood like glass. The ritual words moved through him like they'd been there before his own language. Pass on your orders. Post and orders remain as directed. He wanted to say more, to say, "Did you see that?" And the wanting embarrassed him rookie raw and foolish. He cut it off at the root. He marched off the mat and did not look back. Inside the guard shack, the heat felt obscene. He pulled the door to with his foot and unbuttoned his blouse one notch and then another. His hands shook a quarter-inch as he unlaced his gloves. He aligned them perfectly on the shelf and flattened his palms on the wood as if the grain might give him an answer. It gave him his own pulse hard in the heel of each hand. Sergeant Maria Torres, his squad leader, stood in the doorway long enough to take his measure. She was not tall, but she had a way of owning space that reminded him of a lioness at a watering hole, watchful, sure she belonged. Her uniform did not make her sharp. She made the uniform sharp. "How's the air?" she asked. That was a Torres way of asking everything at once. Still, he said, "Foggy." She stepped inside, eyes scanning the microscopic. She adjusted the angle of his cover on the peg a single degree. "You held bearing." "Yes, Sergeant. You come off the mat like you were born there." "Thank you, Sergeant." "A beat, too." "Anything." "Normal out there." He thought of his grandfather's word, silence, like a place. He thought of the eyes beyond the chain. He thought of how a story once told becomes lighter in the teller and heavier in the listener. He swallowed that weight. "No, Sergeant." Torres studied him long enough for his ears to burn, then gave a short nod. "Get water. Get warm. And Cole, leave the night on the mat when you come off it." "Yes, Sergeant." She left him to the humming radiator and the clock that insisted on being a little too loud. He drank from the tin cup, the water metallic as a penny on his tongue, and tried to slow the film in his head. He told himself it was the angle of the light. He told himself some tourist had slipped the chain and then slipped away. He told himself a thing can move through fog like a swimmer moves through silk and leave nothing but a rope's shiver behind. He told himself a lot of things until words felt like stepping on ice. By the time he lay in his bunk boots squared under the rack uniform, hung like a skin that could stand up without him. Ethan had convinced his mind to stop replaying the face and start replaying the manual. He saw the crisp columns of instruction under his eyelids and tried to breathe along their edges. Sleep came in fits, a series of hills he half climbed and slid down. He dreamed anyway. Not frightening, not even clear. Just the impression of wool that scratched, and a letter folded so many times the paper felt like cloth, and a farm fence under snow, and a hand raised not to strike, but to ask. When he woke, he had the shape of a name in his mouth, like a word he'd heard once and forgotten exactly where to place. He didn't write it down. It felt like writing it would admit something into the world he couldn't take back. Morning made the cemetery look like the place people bring their children to learn how to whisper. The fog was gone. Sun found gold in every pin and badge. The day guards drilled with an exactitude that looked cruel until you understood it as love. Ethan pushed himself until the edge of his vision salted and his lungs sanded out and his muscles shook micro-tremors only he knew about. He meant to sweat out the night. Sweat only made space for it. The hours between breakfast and his next watch felt like the wrong size. He wrote his grandfather a text and erased it. He wrote his father, and didn't hit send. At lunch, he sat alone with his fork and the noise of other men's laughter and a dull ache behind his right eye that medicine couldn't quite chase. When Torres passed behind him and clapped once on the doorframe, he felt it in his spine like a tuning fork. Cole. Sergeant. You're up again tonight. Yes, Sergeant. Put the night back where it goes. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She was not unkind. She was also not anything but exact. Dusk laid copper on the headstones. Evening pulled a hush up from the grass. When he took the plaza again, the mat welcomed and judged him at once. He eased the rifle into the carry that was both cradle and grip. He tasted the air. It was cleaner than the night before, like the fog had run a comb through itself. He felt the first 21 go down like a cold drink. He felt the second like a prayer. At 2 hours in, the buzz of the lights climbed again, as if some hand somewhere was turning a knob up to see what the day would do when pressed. He reached the heel line. He turned. He counted. The edge of his eye said there was nothing there. He took one step, then two, then three, and at 4, the mist rippled without a wind. The figure was there again, closer than before, not at the far sweep of chain, but nearly at the corner of the plaza, where the angle of the stone threw a wedge of shadow. The same cut of jacket, the same puties, tight and neat. The chin tilted an inch higher than last time, like a man deciding whether to risk the next ridge. No threat in the stance, no pleading either. Only a kind of gravity, as if he were the heaviest thing the fog could hold. Ethan felt the pull of 1,000 small instincts to blink too long to shift a foot to swallow in a way the floodlights could see. He strangled each in turn. He let the math of the mat own him. He walked. On the return, the place was empty again. He told himself good. He told himself better. He did not notice that he was relieved and disappointed in the same breath until the relief started to feel like a betrayal of the discipline he loved. He finished the hour. He surrendered the post. He cleaned the rifle until the oil smelled like memory. He folded his gloves, tipped his cover, and pretended the night had not given him a second look at a man who shouldn't exist. Back in his rack, the name returned like a tide washing one syllable onto sand. He let it sit there wet and shining and did not touch it. By morning, he had resolved that if the figure came again, he would do exactly what the creed asks hold. But he would also do what the part of him not found in any manual whispered like a wire in the wind, watch for what the dead want. Out on the hill, the wind shifted. Somewhere a fox barked once and went quiet. And at the edge of the day's drills, a historian Ethan didn't yet know would open a file and say a name he had not yet formed. The silence in Arlington is not just silence. At night, it's layered the weight of marble pressing down on sound, the soft hush of the grass beneath countless headstones, the wind's thin whistle threading through cedar branches. For Private Ethan Cole, the silence had become its own language. And now, after 2 nights in a row of seeing something or someone where no one was supposed to stand, he couldn't stop translating every crease of fog as if it were a phrase he should know. That morning, Sergeant Torres handed out assignments with her usual clipped efficiency. Her eyes swept the squad like a scanner, measuring more than she ever said out loud. When they locked on him, he felt the same pressure he'd felt on the mat. Cole? She said you're shadowing the historian detail this afternoon. The announcement drew a couple of sidelong glances. Normally, rookies rotated through physical tasks, polishing drills, inspections before being given anything that looked remotely academic. Torres didn't explain, and he didn't ask. A tomb guard doesn't question the order. Still, his gut knew this was not routine. By noon, he found himself walking beside Dr. Marcus Halloway, a civilian historian contracted to catalog some of the lesser-known names buried near the tomb. Dr. Halloway was wiry graying at the temples and carried a satchel of folders that looked ready to burst with secrets. He walked with the distracted gait of a man whose mind was several steps ahead of his feet. "You're Ethan Halloway?" asked, without looking up. His voice softened by years of lecture halls. "Yes, sir. Your grandfather, George Cole Navy. He served near Da Nang, correct?" The question stopped Ethan's breath. How do you know that Halloway smiled faintly as if pleased with himself? "I read files. Family connections matter when studying the legacy of service. Did you know George Cole's unit once stood guard over a temporary field of graves before the bodies were flown home?" He wrote about it in a letter I uncovered years ago. I thought of that when I saw your name on the roster." Ethan didn't know what to say. He had known his grandfather spoke rarely about Vietnam, but not about graves. And suddenly, the mist of the night before pressed against his ribs again. They stopped at a row of stones, World War I dead names, mostly forgotten by time and family. The marble was weather-worn, the engraving softer than the newer headstones. Holloway crouched, brushing away a veil of dirt from one particular name, Private Samuel Whitlock, 1896 to 1918. "He was 19, Holloway said. "Caught in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Buried here in 1921 after the remains were returned." He tapped the corner of the stone gently, as if greeting an old friend. "A boy from Ohio like you, and, from what the letters say, he was posted missing for days before they found him." Ethan's stomach dropped. He hadn't spoken the name aloud, but the syllables that had clung to his dreams suddenly aligned with what he saw carved into marble. Whitlock. That was it. The name he'd half remembered in sleep. He heard it now like a tolling bell. "Sergeant Torres wants me to know this," he asked carefully. Holloway glanced up, expression unreadable. "Maybe she knows you're meant to, or maybe she just wanted me to keep you busy. Either way, the past has a way of making itself seen when it wants to." That evening, when Ethan prepared for his third night watch in a row, he felt a tautness in his chest. He couldn't quite name. He checked every crease of his uniform twice, polished the rifle metal until it gleamed like water and forced his mind into the manual's rhythm. But no matter how many times he recited the creed in his head, the name Whitlock throbbed there, demanding to be acknowledged. At 1:55 a.m., the fog began to form again. It rose from the grass like breath curling in ribbons toward the marble thickening at the edges of the chain. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, though he knew it wasn't fear that made his palm damp. It was recognition. At 2:03, exactly the same as before, the figure materialized. Not at the far edge, not in the shadows, but closer. Close enough that Ethan could see the detail of the wool, the mud-darkened hem of the breeches, and the thin line of a scar across the young man's cheek. Private Samuel Whitlock. This time the figure lifted a hand again, not sharply, not like a salute, but like a man raising his palm to swear something. Ethan's throat locked. He forced his eyes to stay forward, his pace unwavering, but the weight of that gesture pulled at him harder than the night air. 21 steps, heel line, turn, pause. By the time he turned back, the figure was gone. When his relief came, he transferred his orders perfectly. Rifle-sharp voice steady. But inside his bones trembled with a truth he could not tell anyone. The dead had shown themselves twice now, and they weren't just shadows. They carried intent. In the shack, Torres met his eyes again. Bearing, she asked. Holding, Ethan said. But when he lay in his rack, the silence pressed him again. And in the dark, where no one could hear him, he whispered the name once, Whitlock, just to see how it felt on his tongue. It felt like a door. And it had just opened. By midday, the world had ironed itself flat again. No fog, no mystery. Just winter sun striking marble until the headstones looked like they were lit from inside. Private Ethan Cole moved through it like a man walking along the skin of a drum, aware of the tautness beneath every step. He carried the name that had slept on his tongue the night before as if it were contraband. Whitlock. He didn't say it aloud. He let it live between heartbeats. Sergeant Torres sent him with a nod and no further explanation to the little brick administration building tucked below the hill where the air always smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil. Inside, a counter of thick glass separated the public lobby from the archives maze. Dr. Marcus Holloway appeared from it with a stack of gray Hollinger boxes at his hip and a grin that never seemed to leave his eyes. Guard Cole Holloway said as if they'd known each other for years. "Come on back, someone I want you to meet." Ethan followed him through a throat of narrow hallways into a reading room where the light fell clean and angled through high windows. There, bent over a flatbed scanner with white cotton gloves on, was a woman in her 30s with a coil of black hair pinned at the nape of her neck. She glanced up. Brown eyes sharp with focus that softened a notch when she clocked the uniform. Ethan Cole. "This is Dr. Sarah Lynn," Holloway said. "If it ever had a name here and then lost it, she's the one who'll find the thread." Sarah peeled off one glove and offered her hand. Her shake was brief, warm, sure. Dr. Lynn or Sarah is fine, she said. Have a seat. Marcus tells me you're the sentinel with a particular interest in the night watch. I'm a sentinel, Ethan said, careful. Particular interest sounded like confession. Her mouth did a half smile. You're not the first to come down here after midnight posts with a question that doesn't fit the form. Relax. We keep confidences as religiously as you keep cadence. Holloway slid a box onto the table and lifted the lid. Inside were folders labeled in brittle handwriting and cards typed on a machine that must have rattled like a cage when it worked. He set out a cemetery map, a copy of an old section ledger, and a photographed sepia edges scalloped of boys in wool tunics with the 79th Division's Lorraine cross patch stitched to their sleeves. You ever heard of the Walker? Sarah asked, almost casual, the way a doctor might ask about a symptom she expects and knows how to treat. Ethan kept his eyes on the photograph. No, ma'am. Good, she said. Don't go looking for stories. But since you're here, she turned a swiveling monitor toward him and brought up a digitized report. Unofficially across decades, a small handful of sentinels have reported seeing a World War I infantryman walking the edge of the Tomb Plaza in fog. Always at approximately the same hour between 2 and 3. Never interacting with visitors, never breaching, just present. She tapped the screen. I have 3 such accounts from 73, 91, and 2009 verbal not written. 2 men wouldn't let me record them. One finally did when he retired. None wanted their names attached. Holloway leaned back in his chair, letting the idea settle. Cameras aren't much help, he added. Old ones washed out in fog. Newer ones pick up artifacts, light blooming, sensor noise. You know what you know, not what the pixels say. Ethan studied the 79th Division photo until it blurred. And you call him the Walker. We don't call him anything officially, Sarah said. Unofficially, the name stuck. Dozens of soldiers from the Meuse-Argonne were reinterred here. Some rested as unknown for years. Names have a way of slipping through fingers in war. The Walker. If that's what he is, feels like the shape that missing takes. Holloway slid a card from a file. Burial card. Whitlock Samuel J. Pert Smee Kamotmin, M. 313th Infantry, 79th Division, Ohio, died Octin 1918. He laid the card on a foam cradle as if it were fragile enough to bruise. Grave Section 18, Site 3227, reinterred 1921. That's the name you were shadowing with me yesterday. The name struck with the dull ringing certainty of a mallet on a bell. Ethan didn't look up. I didn't say I was shadowing anything. No, Sarah said gently. But he did. There was a hush between them, the kind that happens when more than one person chooses not to fill air with words. Sarah broke it without breaking it. Here's the catch. There's also this. She drew out a second card, brow furrowing. Unknown WWWI. Personal effects found partial note Sam Whittle, water damaged. Relocated to Section 27 Unknowns and USCT Historic Grounds. That line item was corrected in pencil in 1932. Someone wrote, possibly cenotaph, at 1832-27 verification lost. So Holloway said quietly, either Whitlock's remains are where the stone says, and an unknown is someone else entirely, or a name meant for a body ended up carved on an empty marker, while the man himself lies under unknown in 27. Section 27, Sarah said, eyes on Ethan. You know its history. Freedmen, U.S. colored troops, contraband hospital burials, early unknowns. A place that teaches you how much the country forgot before it remembered. The Walker's been reported edging that way when he appears. Not often, but often enough to make me wonder. Ethan's mouth had gone dry. He wished for the tin tang of the guard shack cup suddenly. You think Whitlock is asking? I think men who are never named want what every human being wants, Sarah said. Witness, closure. To have the truth of their lives said out loud where it can't be mistaken. I think sometimes that longing is as heavy as a body. He tried to swallow around the iron in his throat. What do you want me to do with that? Nothing, she said, a kindness that didn't sound like surrender. Or everything. You're the one who stands where the living and the dead are both listening. Halloway slid over a photocopy of a chaplain's report, the ink smudged as if someone had written with a fountain pen in bad weather. Chaplain Daniel Meacham, 313th Infantry, November 1918. Poivit Wit Ink Run, courageous in advance, last seen carrying message under fire toward Bois de Illegible. Promise made to mother to be home by Christmas. There's also mention of a scrap of paper waterlogged into a pocket. If it said Sam Whittle and nothing else, that would have been enough for a clerk to hope and hazard a guess. But hope and hazard have gotten more than one man misplaced. Ethan traced the shape of the letters on the photocopy with a gloved finger he didn't realize he'd flexed. He could see the boy in wool putting a letter where it would live close to the heart. He could hear his grandfather's voice. Honor lives in silence. What no one mentions is how loud silence can be when it's tied to a name you can almost say. Let me try, he said so softly he wasn't sure if he'd intended Sarah or the air to hear. I won't break the mat. I won't. But off the mat, if he's pointing, I'll try. Sarah held his gaze long enough to make sure she wasn't making him into more than he was. Then I'll pull everything we have on 183227, section 27. Unknowns from 1921 transfers and any Red Cross correspondence that mentions a Sam from Ohio. You keep your watch. And Cole Halloway added, almost fatherly, don't eat yourself alive in the process. You can carry a promise so long it begins to eat the man carrying it. Ethan's laugh was more breath than sound. I'm new here, sir. The only thing I carry well so far is a rifle. Promises use the same muscles, Sarah said. Different weight. He left the archives with a thin folder in hand and a thicker file spinning in his chest. Outside, the afternoon had gone hard blue and brittle cold. The grass made a sound like silk if you pressed your boot into it. From up the hill came the faint, precise click-pause-click of a drill class working the turn. Every sound felt both too sharp and too far away. Back at quarters, Torres intercepted him with a look that could pin a man without touching him. You find what you were after. I wasn't after anything, he said too quickly. Sure you were. You think I don't know a head that's running laps when I see it? Guard's job is to keep the line where it belongs. That includes the one between your ears. She let that hang in the air, softening it with a grudging, almost smile. Whatever you're chewing on, spit it out before you take the mat. Yes, Sergeant. He tried. He focused on the ritual of preparation, the brushing, the lint rolling the angle, checking the sanding of every roughness a rookie can't bear to show. He bound his mind to doing as if doing could drown thinking. By the time he stepped onto the plaza at 1:40, the night had already begun to lift itself out of the earth in pale sheets. He told himself he wouldn't look, that if anything changed, the change would have to come through the corner of his vision's discipline, not the greed of a direct stare. He set his heel to the mat, felt the spring of it give and return, and let the first 21 scrape the rust from his nerves. By the third run, he was breathing to numbers instead of fear. By the sixth, his heart had found the old guard cadence as if it had been hiding behind a door. At 2:02, the floodlights thrummed. At 2:03, the fog's edge billowed like a curtain someone hasn't fully decided to draw. He turned, counted, stepped. The figure was there, closer still, a yard beyond the chain, no menace, no motion, except the slow lift of the right-hand palm. Out fingers spread the way a man might raise a pledge or stall a team of horses. The face the same too young, too old tilt, the little cut on the cheek like a comma at the end of a sentence that hadn't finished. The eyes held his. Not by force. He would not allow force, but by a gravity that recognized gravity. Ethan kept the metronome beating in his head and refused the stutter of a misstep. When he reached the heel line, he gave the ritual pause. The hand lowered. The figure's mouth shaped something one syllable, maybe two. It might have been air. It might have been name. It might have been find. Ethan turned back. The place beyond the chain was empty again. He did not let the absence feel like a loss. He let it feel like a message delivered and filed. Off the mat, he made himself slow. He made himself clean the rifle like prayer. He stacked his gloves like promises. He sat at the little desk in the barracks with a stub of pencil and wrote in letters as neat as he could manage Samuel J. Whitlock. Cumber M. 313th, Ohio. Section 183227 unknown in 27203 The Walker. He paused, the pencil hovered over the page, then scratched 4 more words. What do you want? Sleep caught him on the wrong side of dawn. It brought him a short, bright dream. A boy crouched in mud letter under his shirt, a stand of trees at the edge of a field, the word Lance burned into the paper before water blurred it to ash gray. When he woke, his hand was already reaching for the uniform he hadn't taken off in his mind. He didn't know yet that in a drawer Sarah Lynn would find a misfiled Red Cross index card with a lance of its own and a mother's name that would make the air leave his lungs. He only knew this, he had not chosen any of it, and still somehow it had chosen him. Outside, the wind moved over the graves like a hand over hair, smoothing the day flat. Above the tomb, the lights took their patient place, and the matte black perfect unforgiving waited for the one man whose job it would be to hear whatever the dead decided to say next. He woke to the kind of gray that makes mourning feel like an apology. The barracks windows held a film of frost that spidered the glass, and the radiator ticked like a clock, trying to remember how to keep time. Ethan lay on his back and watched his breath fade from the pain, counting the beats between inhale and exhale the way he counted the heel line on the mat. It calmed him for a few seconds at a time, then the name forced its way back up his throat. Whitlock. It had the weight of a coin, small but insistent, in the pocket of his mind. The note he'd scratched in pencil sat on the little desk like a confession he hadn't meant to write. He folded the page once, then again, then slid it into the inner pocket of his blouse, where he kept the saint's medal his grandfather had given him years ago without ceremony. I don't know if you pray with saints, George had said, handing over the worn oval on a black cord, but sometimes a thing that's been held by a lot of hands knows how to hold you back. Ethan had smiled then more out of love than belief, and looped the cord around his neck because it made his grandfather's shoulders lower in a way that looked like relief. The smell of coffee and starch drifted down the hallway. Men's voices rolled and broke against the cinder block. He dressed with the meticulousness that passed for faith. In this house, creases sharp as a blade, brass bright enough to catch any doubt and send it elsewhere, laces flat and sure. When he stepped outside, the air bit clean and the sky had scrubbed itself into a pale winter blue. He cut across the hill boots, whispering through short grass that had turned the color of old straw, and found a bench where tourists sat in warmer months when the cemetery looked like a long white song. His phone held a single draft text to his grandfather. Ever wake and feel like a name is standing over you? He deleted the words typed. How are you feeling instead deleted that too and pressed call. It rang only once. Boy George Cole said, by way of greeting voice, sanded down by years and Marlboro smoke and the stubborn refusal to complain. You on the hill? Yes, sir. The honorific slipped out without thought. It's cold. It's supposed to be, George said. Cold keeps the world honest. They let a little silence ride the line. Ethan pictured his grandfather in the old armchair by the window, a blanket over his knees he'd deny, kneading the battered mug with the cracked navy crest. Sweating coffee rings on the side table. He could hear the morning radio murmuring 2 rooms away. Some oldies DJ trying to wake the town with a joke that wasn't funny and didn't need to be. You didn't call to talk about the weather, George said eventually. You never did, even when you were 5 and told me it was sky soup. You called because you're carrying something, and you're trying to figure out if it'll get lighter if you say it or heavier. Ethan breathed out a laugh that hurt a little. You always gave me lousy options. That's life, not me. A cough. A pause. Well, say it. He stared at the field of stones fanning out below each one, a white thumbnail pressed into the land. I keep thinking about a name. I've been down in the archives helping a historian. There's a World War I private, Ohio boy, Whitlock, and there might have been a mix-up. Maybe his marker's a cenotaph and he's under an unknown in section 27. I don't know yet, but he stopped jaw working around a truth he wasn't supposed to speak. And, Granddad, I thought I saw someone in the fog. Twice. In old uniform. I held bearing. I swear I did, but it felt like he was asking something. The line went so quiet, he wondered if it had dropped. Then George exhaled a long, careful sound. Section 27, he repeated. You know what it is? Yes. Ethan said, hearing Dr. Lynn's voice in his head the way she'd described it, like a map you only learn once someone tells you where to stand. USCT, Friedman, Early Unknowns. The place you walk if you want the unvarnished story of who we did right by and who we didn't, at least not on time. George cleared his throat. You ever see your father's eyes when they call the roll at church on Memorial Day? Sometimes, Ethan said. He looks away. He looks inside, George corrected, not unkindly. There's a whole country in there, things he never says. Some men talk, some men hold. You're one of the holders like him, like me most days. But I'm going to tell you what I wish someone told me before the jungle put its teeth in me. There's holding and then there's hiding. Honor lives in silence, yes, but it dies in it too if you won't speak when you're meant to. Ethan watched a groundskeeper push a small cart along a path in the distance, the engine quiet as a sewing machine. Protocol says the post is the post. It is, George said firmly. Don't you ever break that mat for anything living or dead. That's not just a rule. That's the spine of the whole thing, but you got hours off it. You got a brain and a heart that don't leave your skull and your chest when you hang the rifle. You can be two kinds of faithful at once. He coughed again, the sound catching. You asked me once what it felt like to stand guard over a field of temporary graves. I didn't answer you right. You were too young. It felt like this you count in your head so you don't count what you're counting. You pray you'll do right by strangers, and every now and then you hear your own name in the wind and realize it ain't your name at all. It's somebody's mama saying please. He didn't realize he'd closed his eyes until he opened them, and the light made them water. What if I'm wrong? He asked quietly. What if I chase ghosts and lose the line I'm supposed to keep? Then you'll have to forgive yourself fast, George said, with the blunt mercy of men who've made worse mistakes than the ones they're willing to name. But I don't think you're wrong. I think you're being put in a place to see a thing and carry it to the place it belongs. That's all a man can ask out of a life. A breeze slipped around Ethan's collar and found the warm place under the saint's metal. He reached up and pressed it through the fabric, feeling the oval's edges mapped to his sternum. You ever see anything, shadows? His grandfather said. Once in Da Nang, when we moved a row of bodies in the dark, the tarp lifted and the moon put a face on a boy for half a second, and I could have sworn he opened his mouth to breathe. But that was just the mind doing what it does to stay human when it's standing in a place that ain't. This is different. This is the hill. Different rules. If the dead wanted to haunt you, they'd rattle and wail. He didn't. He showed you where to look. Another pause, weighty as a hand on a shoulder. Go on and look then. Not on duty, but go. Section 27. Ethan said, tasting the numbers as if they were a prayer. Mum, George said, and when you're off, come see your old man this weekend. He won't say it, but he needs to look at your face when you tell him what you've done with the uniform. It'll put a brick back in his wall that fell out when he wasn't looking. They said goodbye in the way they always did, with nothing that sounded like goodbye at all. When the call ended, the cemetery's quiet seemed to deepen, as if it had been listening in and approved of the verdict. He carried Section 27 under his tongue all day. It flavored the drills, the cleaning, the briefings, the scan of the duty roster. When Torres handed him his evening assignment midnight again, her eyes flicked to his inner pocket and back as if she could see the folded paper beating there like a second heart. You look like a man who wants to run a marathon in a closet, she said. Whatever's on your mind, chain it to the fence for 4 hours. After that, pick it back up if you have to, but not before. Yes, Sergeant, he said. He meant it. He also knew how human promises shrink in the night. The plaza accepted him like a test he was strangely grateful to take. The first pass cleared the noise. The second took the day's grit and filed it down until everything gleamed. On the third, his breathing linked to the light. And on the fourth, the fog began to come not thick, not theatrical, just thin veils knitting together in the low places. He kept his eyes where they belonged. He did not hunt for anything. He let the night do what it does when it decides a man has earned seeing. At 2:01, a faint hum lifted from the lamps. At 2:03, something like a shadow's weight pressed on the air just beyond the chain. He did not turn to it. He turned away as the creed requires. He counted 1, 2, and in the corner of his gaze, a right hand rose again, palm open. Then different two fingers extended, pointing off the plaza, not toward the amphitheater or the road, but downhill, where the land curved toward the older sections, like a shoulder dipped in thought. He did not change pace. He did not break stance, but a map unfolded in his head. He hadn't known he carried the path past the Custis Lee mansion, the slope that rolled toward the river, the bend in the row where Section 27 began without announcing itself. He saw it the way you see a place you've only ever been told about by the people who love it, not as lines and numbers, but as a gathering of meanings. He finished the turn. He came back. The space was empty again. "Post and orders remain as directed," he said 2 hours later when the relief came. His voice did not tremble. Off the mat, he let his hands shake once, just enough to tell his body he'd heard it, and then steadied them on the rifle like a man telling a skittish horse he meant no harm. He tried to sleep. The barracks hummed with the small noises of men pretending they were alone. He lay on his side and watched the dark spill its ink across the floor. When the dream came, it didn't announce itself. It simply replaced the room. He stood in waist-deep fog that smelled of river and metal. He knew without knowing that this was Arlington, but not now, then. The ground under his boots was rucked and uneven, as if it had been rolled and unrolled like a rug over time. A figure walked ahead of him, not quite touching the ground, not quite apart from it. The doughboy uniform looked heavier here, wet with a kind of weather that didn't come from sky. Whitlock turned, and the cut on his cheek was a dark thread. He raised his hand in that same pledge-stopping gesture, and then extended the two fingers again, pointing. Ethan followed. They passed rows that were too neat to be the first rows, and too rough to be the newest. They passed a tree whose bark held the ghost of a lightning strike, white like bone. They came to a low rise where the stones changed, older, thinner, some leaning, some wearing the names of men who'd been free and then not, and then free again, depending on who told the story and when. He read a series of markers. United States colored troops dates that bracketed a war the country had never stopped refighting. Beyond them, the plain tablet stamped unknown U.S. soldier, line after line, like teeth in a jaw. Whitlock's hand hovered over one and then another, as if the choice of which to touch mattered as much as breath. Ethan felt the ache of it in his own palm, the human hunger to say this one and have it be true. The soldier turned his face to Ethan's, and though the mouth didn't move, Ethan heard a small sound, not a word, not in English, not in anything. But the meaning lodged in him like a thorn that would not draw blood. "Remember me where I am, not where they think I sleep." He woke with the ache still glowing in his hand as if he'd been holding a coal. The barracks were quiet in the hour before dawn. Somewhere outside, the fox barked once and then let the world be. He sat up, swung his legs over the side, and put his feet on the cold floor the way a man puts his feet on a decision he has already made and will have to live with. He didn't tell Torres. He didn't tell Dr. Lin yet. He dressed and took his place for morning duties and kept his face as unreadable as he knew how. But the map inside him wouldn't fold back up. The two fingers pointed again and again toward a section of ground that had held too many unknowns for too long. When the schedule posted for the afternoon, his off hours made a narrow window that might as well have been a door. He traced the route with his finger once, then closed his fist around the air. He would go to Section 27 when the duty hours allowed, and the rules weren't his alibi for fear. He would walk the line that wasn't on the mat. He would stand where the walker had told him to stand. And if there was something to find a note, a record, a misfiled card, a small human error that had become a long human sorrow, he would carry it back like a message under fire and set it where it belonged. The cemetery does not cheer when a man makes up his mind. It only holds stiller. Outside the window, the light crawled up the sky like a prayer on its elbows. In the distance, the tomb waited with the patience of stone. And down the slope, the older section lay quiet, already knowing something Ethan had only just learned to say: the dead are not asking for miracles. They are asking for names. The storm crashed against Arlington like a living beast. Thunder rolled low and heavy, rattling the marble stones as if the heavens themselves were beating a war drum. Jonathan Kane's boots splashed against shallow pools forming on the plaza, each step a deliberate strike heel-to-toe rifle balanced across his shoulder. The rain stung his face, but he did not flinch. He could not. That was the code. Yet beneath the roar of thunder and the hiss of rain, another sound threaded its way into his senses. At first it was faint, a woman's voice calling his name. Not shouted, but whispered, intimate, as though spoken directly against his ear. Jonathan. His blood chilled. He forced his body to keep moving, each step measured precise, as though nothing had pierced the sacred silence of his duty. But inside his mind raced. No one was permitted to break the line to call to him to interrupt the guard's watch. And yet, the voice had not come from behind the ropes where tourists huddled beneath umbrellas. It had come from the tomb itself. He turned on the mark, pivoting smoothly, eyes straight ahead. Lightning split the sky, casting the white marble in a ghostly glow. And there, just for a heartbeat, he saw her. A woman in a faded raincoat standing by the tomb. Her hair was dark and plastered to her face, her eyes pale, watching him. She did not move, did not blink. His chest tightened. She could not be there. The tomb was sealed, guarded, untouchable. And yet she was standing so close he could see the water dripping from her sleeves. Jonathan's jaw locked. He knew the code he must not break. He must not react. The guard was not a man but a symbol. Symbols do not flinch at shadows. And so he walked one step, then another, the woman's form flickering in the corner of his vision. Jonathan. Her voice was softer now, as if carried by the rain. He dared not turn his head, but the weight of her presence pressed on him. His father's words from long ago echoed in his memory. The dead are never truly silent at Arlington. Listen long enough and you'll hear them. By the next crack of lightning, she was gone. But Jonathan's heart did not slow. He had seen her, not imagined, not dreamed. The rain lashed harder, but the cold in his chest had nothing to do with the storm. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes, time blurred when one stood guard. At last the relief detail approached through the storm, their boots splashing across the plaza. Jonathan completed his final pace and stopped at his mark. The sergeant gave him a quick, sharp nod. Dismissed. Jonathan turned rifle against his shoulder and marched away with flawless precision. His body obeyed, but his mind lingered at the tomb where a woman in a raincoat had stood, where no living soul should have been. He said nothing to the others. The code demanded silence. But as he peeled off his soaked gloves inside the quarters, his hands trembled. He could still hear her voice, and he knew deep in the marrow of his bones this was only the beginning. Jonathan lay awake long after the storm had passed. The barracks were quiet, except for the hum of the heating unit and the occasional creak of settling wood. His uniform hung neatly by the locker rifle, locked in its place boots polished so sharp the dim light would have bounced from them if the overhead bulb had been stronger. His body ached from hours of rigid stance in the downpour, yet sleep would not come. He closed his eyes, but each time he saw her face again, dark hair plastered by the rain, pale eyes fixed on him as if she had been waiting. Her lips had moved with his name, Jonathan. He rubbed his temples. He had been through deployments, firefights, and nights so dark he could not tell sky from ground. Fear was not unfamiliar to him. But this was different. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. He knew that face. He just couldn't place it. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, harsh and unwelcome. Jonathan dressed and reported for inspection, his posture immaculate, his silence absolute. To the others, he looked as steady as stone. Inside, however, every detail of the previous night gnawed at him. During breakfast, his fellow guard Corporal Harris nudged him. "You look like hell, Kane. Storm beat you up." Jonathan shook his head. "I'm fine." His tone cut off further questions. But Harris studied him anyway. "You ever get the feeling Arlington talks back?" Jonathan froze. "What do you mean?" Harris smirked, but his eyes didn't. "Never mind. Just saying you spend long enough on the line, you see things, hear things." He jabbed his fork into scrambled eggs. "But the code keeps our mouths shut, right?" Jonathan forced a small nod. He wanted to press to demand if Harris had seen a woman, if anyone else had heard voices in the storm. But discipline held him back. Later that day, Jonathan walked the grounds during his free hour. The rain had washed the air clean, leaving the scent of wet earth and stone. Visitors trickled in slowly, cameras in hand, their footsteps respectful on the marble paths. Jonathan drifted near the tomb again, though off duty his hands clasped behind his back. The place looked ordinary, but he knew better now. He stopped staring at the white sarcophagus. A whisper threaded through his memory, almost carried on the breeze Jonathan. He exhaled hard. "I saw you," he murmured under his breath. "I know I did." "Talking to yourself, soldier?" Jonathan jerked his head up. An older man stood nearby, leaning heavily on a cane. His uniform cap was tucked beneath his arm, and his chest carried a cluster of faded ribbons. A veteran. "No, sir," Jonathan replied quickly, straightening. The old man's eyes narrowed. "You're Kane, aren't you? I knew your father. Served with him in Desert Storm." Jonathan blinked. "You knew my father?" The man tapped his cane against the ground. "Sure did. Tough bastard. Said Arlington would one day speak to you. Guess he wasn't wrong." Jonathan's skin prickled. "What do you mean?" The veteran leaned closer. "You guards, you think you're just keeping time and ceremony. But this ground is alive, Kane. Some of us hear it louder than others. If you've heard a voice, don't dismiss it. They're trying to tell you something." Before Jonathan could respond, a tour group passed by, and when he looked back, the old man was already walking away, cane clicking against the pavement. That night, Jonathan returned to quarters with the weight of his father's memory pressing on him. He remembered being a boy standing at his father's side at Arlington. His father had told him that the tomb was not just a monument, it was a covenant. If you listen, his father had whispered, "You'll hear them, and one day they might call your name." Jonathan had thought it a story, a lesson to keep reverence alive. Now it was no longer a story. Sleep came in uneasy fragments. At 3 a.m., Jonathan woke, chest tight, the hairs on his neck standing up. He sat upright, heart pounding. A shape stood by his locker. He swallowed hard. The room was dark, but the outline was unmistakable, a woman the same one from the storm. Her raincoat dripped, though no water fell, her hair still wet against her face. Her eyes glowed faintly pale as fog. Jonathan's throat went dry. "Who are you?" he whispered. Her lips parted. The word was breath. A sigh. "Remember." Then she was gone. The locker door rattled softly as though touched. Jonathan pressed his hands against his face, his body trembling. For the first time in years he wanted to run, but he couldn't. He was a guard. And the tomb had spoken. By dawn, resolve had replaced fear. If this spirit wanted him to remember, he would. He owed it to his father, to the silence he had sworn to guard. He would uncover the truth no matter how deep it lay beneath the marble. The morning came raw and knife-bright, as if the storm had washed the sky so clean it might crack. Jonathan Kane shaved by habit, more than need the razor traveling the same mapped angles his hands always knew, but his reflection felt like a stranger wearing his face. He kept seeing her rain-soaked hair paneled to her cheeks, eyes as pale as floodwater mouth forming a single syllable that wasn't a name so much as a command. Remember. He pressed a towel to his jaw and stood very still, listening. Nothing. No whisper stitched into the radiator's hum, no soft knock from the locker door. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling something waited just beyond whatever thin membrane separates the living from the rest. The metal under his t-shirt, his father's old St. Michael, felt heavier than it ever had. He lifted it in his palm and curled his fingers around the metal until the edges bit a crescent into his skin. "I hear you," he said to no one and to someone. "I'm listening." In the mess, Harris studied him over a coffee Jonathan swore could etch glass. "You didn't sleep," Harris said, not bothering to make it a question. "You're walking like your bones have blisters." "Do they?" Jonathan asked, dry. Harris cracked a smile. "Only place blisters show on a guard is the soul." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "That Cap old-timer from yesterday. The one with the cane I asked around. Name's Arthur Beck. Desert Storm. Same battalion as your dad. He's not a talker, but when he does talk, people listen. You want to know what he told Torres once? Arlington's a choir and a courtroom." Jonathan felt the words land like clean blows. "A choir and a courtroom," he repeated. "Yeah. Some nights it sings, some nights you're on the stand. Harris's gaze flicked to the ceiling as if he might find a safer subject up there. Forget I said anything. You'll be fine on post. You always are. The always did not comfort him. It sounded like a sentence. He stirred the coffee and watched the little whirlpool swallow its own tail. Midday. Captain Eleanor Hayes called him into her office, a small room with immaculate files and a view that happened to line up with the tomb's corner in winter when the trees were bare. She didn't invite him to sit. She never did. I want your bearing clean tonight, she said, voice flat as a ruler. Yesterday's storm gave the public spectacle. Today we give them silence. Yes, ma'am. Her eyes found the tightening in his jaw with unerring aim. If something is distracting you, discharge it off post. I don't care if you run it out on the track or pray it out in the chapel. Do not bring it to the mat. A muscle in his cheek jumped. Understood. Hayes let a breath out through her nose, almost a sigh, and in it he heard the rumor Harris had fed him the captain had her own ghosts, the ones she kept folded like letters in a pocket you never empty. You know the code as well as I do, Kane, she said quieter. The public thinks we're statues, but we're men. Men break. Don't wait until you do. A beat. Dismissed. He left with heat in his chest and a colder heat under that anger wrapped around fear. He wasn't angry at Hayes. Discipline had saved his life more times than luck. He was angry at the impossible geometry of what he'd been handed. Guard an immovable silence, and also answer a voice from inside it. On his hour off, he walked down the hill, the grass crisp under his boots, until the paths leveled into the older sections where the headstones changed shape. The dates slid farther back, and history went from tidy to true. He passed markers whose names had settled into the marble like seeds into earth laborers, freedmen. U.S. colored troops, unknowns. The air was different here, like a library you enter by accident and then realize is the one you were supposed to find all along. He stopped at a tablet that read, Only Unknown U.S. Soldier. The letters were simple, the way grief is simple when you strip it of all its ceremonial clothing. He crouched gloved fingers hovering a respectful inch over the stone. Where should I look, he asked, and the question wasn't a challenge. It was a plea. When the answer came, it wasn't words. It was a memory his own, but reframed his father's hand-scarred knuckles. Sun-browned skin adjusting a tie on the day Jonathan enlisted. The way his father's eyes had gone somewhere else for a second and then back to the room. If you stand long enough, the dead will test if you know why you're standing. He'd laughed when his dad said it too young to hear the steel under the sentence. He wasn't laughing now. He turned away because the clock would not forgive him if he didn't. There was still a practical road between haunting and truth, and he intended to walk it. The archives. The building was warm enough to make his ears sting when he stepped inside. It smelled like paper and polish, and 100 quiet arguments with time. At the counter, he asked for Dr. Sarah Lynn, and when she came out, her smile had relief in it he hadn't expected, like she'd been waiting on him, and was glad the waiting part was over. You look like a man who went outside and came back different, she said, ushering him through the door without ceremony. He managed a breath of a laugh. Something like that. They reached the reading room where the light fell aslant through high windows, dust motes floating like patient snow. She had already laid out a small square of a world on the table, a section map marked in pencil burial cards and sleeves, a file of Red Cross correspondence whose ribbon tie she'd loosened but not undone. I dug a little after you left, she said. Whitlock. And something else. He held himself still with the same discipline he used on the mat. What's something else? She lifted the first sleeve. Samuel J. Whitlock Company, M313th Infantry, 79th Division. Died in October 1918. Ohio. That's the card we saw. But then she slid out a second. We have an unknown WWI moved to Section 27 in 1921 with personal effects listed as scrap of paper with Sam Whittle illegible beyond water damage. That might be coincidence. Might. Then here, she nodded toward the correspondence, is a letter from a Mrs. Eliza Ashby, Lancaster, Pennsylvania to the Red Cross 1920 Yadsa. My sister's boy Samuel called Whitlock by his pa, though his father's name wasn't never legal on paper. Sarah glanced up, eyes measuring. Family names get messy. Love does not consult the clerk of records. Jonathan's throat tugged. Lancaster, he said softly. My dad's mother. She was born near there. Sarah's eyebrows lifted just a fraction. So the word you couldn't place had a home. I also found a chaplain's field note that's nothing but a smear of ink and the words Sam Bubby message under fire. And a transfer list that mislabels 2 crates by number corrected in pencil with no signature. She folded her hands. Put all of that together, and we have a story that doesn't prove itself, but asks us very politely to consider a boy promised home by Christmas, a name half remembered by a piece of paper that held rain like a sponge, a grave with a name that might be a cenotaph, and an unknown lying among men whose names history took longer to say. His pulse beat at the hinge of his jaw. You believe it's him, under unknown. She didn't blink away from him. I believe the dead have a way of telling the truth we're ready to hear. I believe you're ready. Why me? It came out harder than he intended. Other men walk this line. Because you heard the word and didn't swat it like a fly, she said simply. Because you want the rule and the mercy both. Because sometimes the hill chooses, and because your father taught you to listen without admitting he was teaching you. The room tilted barely like a ship that's met a wave and found its balance again. He set his palms on the table to keep the practical world under him. If we wanted to do this right, he said, steadying his voice with tasks, what would it take more than a hunch and a haunting? We'd need authorization to exhume, and that's a labyrinth, or some kind of recognition without disturbing remains. 2 paths, Sarah agreed. Exhumation is rare, reserved for strong forensic cause. Paper cause, the kind we're gathering, can earn an inscription, a change to a record, a ceremony. Neither path dishonors. But one will let a family hold a thing they've never had. The other will put a name beside the word unknown in a way that tells the truth without moving bone. Family. The word flicked a switch he didn't know was there. Does he have one left? I don't know yet, she said. The Ashby letter hints at a sister Martha. If Martha had children, if those children had children, someone could exist. It's a long thread, but threads have surprised me before. He exhaled. The metal under his shirt warmed against his skin as if someone had put sunshine in a coin. Find them, he said, and then caught himself flushing. I mean, if you can. Please, I'll do my job on post. Off post, I'll carry what I can. Sarah nodded, and he read in the nod a private agreement with something not in the room. Then we moved careful and fast. War taught me one thing, despite never serving it, she added almost to herself. When a message asks to be carried, it will not wait forever. On his way out, he passed Dr. Halloway in the hall. The older man's smile made fine lines fan from his eyes. Be kind to yourself, Guard Halloway said. The burden of the living is heavy. The gratitude of the dead is heavier. Both will try to make you kneel. Don't. Jonathan stepped back into the February brightness, feeling equal parts steadied and stripped. He took the long way around past the amphitheater and down the lane where magnolias in summer would throw their fat white blossoms like flares. The tomb flashed between trees. He didn't intend to stop. He stopped anyway. Off post in Class A's, he stood at the edge of the plaza and looked, really looked at the marble and the mat and the space beyond the chain where the fog had gathered and shaped a woman's face. Who are you? He asked without demanding. Are you him? Are you someone tied to him? Are you mine? The wind lifted and shifted, bringing the smell of the river and cold iron. In it, faint but certain, he heard his name again, less a call now than a confirmation. It didn't rattle his bones this time. It lengthened them. He returned to quarters and prepared for the night with a reverence that wasn't routine. Each button found its hole like a note finding its chord. Each lace tightened like a vow pulled snug. Before he set the cover on his head, he touched St. Michael, then pressed 2 fingers to the brim like he could pin the prayer beneath it. Harris caught him at the door, fussing with his own collar. You look like a man going to a wedding or a war, Harris said. Same difference, Jonathan answered, and surprised himself with the truth of it. The plaza greeted him with the cool, close quiet that comes when the city forgets itself. He placed his heel on the black mat, and the first click went out like a drop in a still pond. He let it widen. The turn showed him their geometry. The numbers braided themselves to his breath. He thought about nothing and everything the way you do when the body carries more than the mind can set down. At 2:03, as if the ground had looked at a clock and nodded, the air at the chain thickened. He did not turn toward it. He turned with it because that is what the post requires. But he felt them as distinctly as one feels heat from a hand before it touches skin. On his return pass, the figure was a suggestion more than a sight, a softening of the dark that described a human height. The mouth shaped a syllable. Re. He held his count. Mem. He held his pace. Ber. He did. He would. The relief came like it always did, footfalls, measured inspection. Sharp words, ceremonial enough to be almost sacred. Pass on your orders, post and orders remain as directed. He surrendered the mat and felt the peculiar vertigo of being a symbol 1 second and a man the next. Back inside he wrote in a hand less steady than he wanted. Sarah Ashby, Lancaster. Martha Arthur, Beck. Dad Choir / Courtroom 203. Remember. He folded the paper and slid it in beside the metal, the two weights settling against each other like old friends. He lay down, and for the first time since the storm, sleep came as mercy instead of ambush. He dreamed the same dream, but different. A farmhouse lamp in a Pennsylvania winter window, a woman in a raincoat on a platform waiting for a train that didn't come, a boy in wool reading a letter by candle stub, his lips moving on the words "Home by Christmas," though his eyes already knew another kind of calendar. When he woke, his face was wet. He did not wipe it immediately. He let the salt dry where it was proof he had not armored himself all the way through. The day would bring forms and drills and the visible dignity the guard gives the world like water to a thirsty throat. The night would bring whatever the night had left to say. Between them, he would walk to the archives and stand in the doorway with a question more naked than any he'd ever asked in uniform. Did you find her? Did Whitlock have a living name left? He hoped the answer was yes. He feared it. He wanted it anyway. Outside Arlington held its quiet like a promise and a verdict both. In the wind that moved along the rows, patient, unhurried. Something like a blessing passed over him, light as breath. He nodded into it, a man acknowledging a command he was finally ready to carry to completion. The darkness clung to the cemetery like a heavy curtain, and every movement of the wind seemed to whisper secrets only the marble stones could understand. Sergeant Michael Donovan, his rifle at his shoulder, took each measured step with a precision drilled into his very bones. The weight of silence pressed against him, yet beneath it lay something deeper, something restless like a heartbeat in the soil. His chest tightened as though the air itself conspired to remind him of grief long buried, but never forgotten. He saw the figure again, just ahead, drifting near Section 60, where the newer stones bore names of soldiers not much younger than himself, the faint shimmer of white, a dress uniform coat. Or was it mist playing cruel tricks? His jaw clenched as he tried to steady his breathing. Focus, discipline, one step, then another. But his boots felt heavy, dragging through unseen memory. For a moment he wasn't at Arlington. He was back in Afghanistan. Dust fire and the copper sting of blood filled his senses. A brother in arms lying broken in the dirt, calling out with eyes too wide, too empty. Michael had sworn he would never let go of that face, that voice. Yet here it was again, superimposed against the ghostly outline drifting across the graves. Daniel, he whispered the name torn from a place he didn't even know still lived inside him. The wind didn't answer, but the figure paused, turned its head ever so slightly, and Michael swore he caught the glint of recognition, like eyes meeting his. His pulse thundered loud enough to drown out every other sound in the night. For the first time since his duty began, the tomb guard's steps faltered. His heels slipped half an inch out of line. The weight of shame hit instantly. His entire being had been forged to prevent that. The creed was absolute. My standard will remain perfection, yet perfection cracked in that moment, split open by the unbearable truth that grief could not be marched away. He lifted his chin, forcing his eyes forward, but the tears burned hot, betraying the iron in his posture. He could feel his fellow guards' eyes on him, even if they were not there. He could feel the memory of commanders past the line of warriors, stretching back generations, holding him accountable. And still the whisper inside clawed, "Why him? Why not me?" The figure dissolved into shadow again, slipping between rows of white stones. Michael's breath shook. His discipline told him to bury it, to drive the emotion deep where it could not poison his duty. But tonight was different. Tonight the barrier cracked, and with it came something raw, something human. He stopped at the end of his measured path and turned sharply, every movement crisp as doctrine. Yet within his soul quaked. His mind replayed the way Daniel had looked the last time he saw him. The sudden silence of the gunfire, the sand swallowing everything. That face was here again, not in memory, but in presence. The stillness of the crowd, though distant now, seemed to draw closer, as if the living and the dead both bore witness to his breaking. Michael's lips parted, words slipping out like a confession whispered to God alone. "I see you," he breathed so faint only the stones might have heard. For an instant, the world around him shifted, an almost imperceptible change in the air. The heaviness gave way to something else, something that ached but did not suffocate. He felt absurdly as if he had been answered. When his next step rang out on the stone, it carried not only the weight of duty, but also of grief too long chained. He would not falter again, but the rhythm of his march now pulsed with something more than discipline. It pulsed with memory, with love, with loss, and with the unshakable sense that the ghost was not here to haunt him, but to remind him. The moonlight spilled silver over Arlington, casting every row of marble headstones into long spectral shadows. Sergeant Michael Donovan's stride was steady now, but beneath the surface of his rigid composure ran a torrent he could barely contain. The echo of that fleeting vision, his fallen brother Daniel's face, would not leave him. It clung to his chest with the weight of a metal he could not take off. He pressed forward, rifle at his shoulder, every step measured as doctrine demanded. The cadence of his boots rang hollow against the stone path. Yet to him each strike was a drumbeat of memory. Every click of the heel echoed with "Why him, not me?" He tried to anchor himself. Precision, duty, honor, he whispered inside his head, the sacred triad of the guard. He straightened his back so firmly the muscles in his shoulders screamed, but the truth was already burning cracks into the armor of his discipline. He wasn't just guarding a tomb, he was staring down his own ghosts, and they were staring back. From the edge of the shadows, the figure appeared again, clearer this time, clad not in mist, but in the distinct outline of a soldier's dress blues, faintly glowing as though lit from within. Michael's throat went dry. The world narrowed to a tunnel, everything else fading until it was just him, the tomb, and that apparition. The ghost stood at the head of one stone, its back straight, posture sharp, a soldier still at attention even in death. The sight cut Michael deeper than any wound he had ever taken, because he recognized that stance. He had drilled beside it. He had bled beside it. Daniel Michael murmured again, this time with both fear and longing. His voice cracked, breaking the cold night like glass. For the first time the figure moved. Slowly, with deliberate grace, it raised its hand in salute. The motion was flawless, military perfect, just as Daniel's had always been. The sight nearly dropped Michael to his knees. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, threatening to burst out of his chest. He snapped his head forward, struggling to regain control. "No," he hissed to himself under his breath. "This is duty. I cannot." But the tears blurred his vision. He blinked hard, forcing them away, terrified that any observer might see weakness in the guard. Yet there was no denying it anymore. The ghost wasn't some trick of exhaustion or a shadow playing games with him. It was there, real enough to shatter the shell he had worn for years. The weight of silence grew unbearable. Finally, Michael did something he had never done during duty. He broke his perfect silence. His voice was low, quivering, but it carried through the night like confession. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I left you there. It should have been me." The wind stirred the branches above, as though answering a hollow moan that rippled across the rows of stones. The figure did not vanish this time. It held its salute unwavering, as if to tell him something words never could. Michael's chest tightened until it hurt. He could almost hear Daniel's laugh, that reckless grin he'd worn when they were just boys training together long before war claimed their innocence. And in that sound, half memory, half hallucination, Michael felt forgiveness wash over him like the night's cold air. It was not peace, not yet, but it was something closer than he had felt in years. Still, the rules were absolute. He could not abandon his post, not for grief, not for ghosts. With hands that trembled only in his mind, he turned sharply at the end of his path. Rifle still angled, boots striking stone with unyielding rhythm. To anyone watching, he was perfect again. To himself, he was standing at the edge of breaking. But even as he marched, he carried a new awareness with him. Daniel was still here, not buried in sand half a world away, not lost to memory. He was here at Arlington, standing among the honored dead, watching him, saluting him. And Michael knew he could no longer pretend his ghosts were gone. The night deepened, folding the cemetery in layers of stillness, each quieter than the last. The hush was so complete it felt sacred, yet to Michael Donovan it was also suffocating. He marched on every turn of his path, like an echo chamber trapping his thoughts. The ghost salute lingered in his vision, etched sharper than the moonlight against the stone. He had sworn to keep his duty unsullied, untouched by the storm of his own memories. But tonight Arlington itself seemed to conspire against him. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine, and it reminded him too much of the night he lost Daniel. He had dragged his brother's limp body across sand drenched in iron, swearing he'd get him home. And yet all he had brought home was the memory. Now that memory walked beside him. Every step along his guard route, Michael felt it, an unseen presence at his flank. It didn't speak. It didn't move. But it was there, carrying silence heavier than words. His throat tightened each time he thought to look. And when his eyes darted against all training, the figure was there again. Always in dress blues, always upright, always saluting. Michael's jaw clenched hard enough that his teeth ached. Not real, he whispered through his breath. Fatigue. Mind tricks. But the sound of his own voice betrayed him. He wanted it to be real. Because if it was, then maybe he hadn't lost Daniel completely. Maybe there was still something left to redeem. The ritual of his pacing should have steadied him. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Rifle at shoulder. 21 more. But each repetition only seemed to draw him closer to collapse. He could feel sweat trickling cold down his back despite the night air. His heart raced in uneven surges as though his body knew what his mind refused to admit. This night was not ordinary. It was breaking him. A noise snapped through the silence, a crack sharp as gunfire. Michael whipped his head, instincts flaring. For a split second, he was back in the desert, crouched behind broken walls, muzzle flashes cutting the night. His grip on the rifle tightened, the ghost gone from sight as adrenaline spiked. But it wasn't enemy fire. It was a branch brittle and fallen under its own weight. Yet his hands trembled as though the war had returned. "Steady," he muttered. "You're not there. You're here." His breath came ragged, his body caught between battlefield reflex and ceremonial precision. Then as he resumed his path, something shifted. He realized the ghost was no longer saluting from afar. It was closer, just behind him. Michael froze mid-step. Breaking discipline was unthinkable, but so was ignoring what he felt. He turned his head slowly, deliberately against every fiber of training. And there it was, Daniel, face pale in the moonlight, eyes steady and sorrowful. Michael's breath caught in his throat. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. You're gone." The figure did not reply. It only held his gaze. Then it stepped forward, closing the space between them. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears. He could feel the weight of tears threatening to fall again, but he fought them back, his body rigid, as if the uniform itself demanded it. Daniel raised his hand, not in salute this time, but in a slow, deliberate gesture toward Michael's chest. The touch never landed, but Michael swore he felt the pressure, a weight of memory pressing directly over his heart. Michael's knees nearly buckled. "I tried," he choked. "God knows I tried. I couldn't save you. I wasn't enough." The apparition's lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. Instead, the wind rose, suddenly sweeping through the rows of headstones in a mournful chorus. The trees bent and sighed. Michael felt his skin prickle. When he blinked, the ghost was gone again. And yet something remained, a warmth over his chest, a fleeting trace of presence, as though his brother had left him a piece of strength before vanishing. Michael drew a shaky breath and resumed his march. His boots struck harder now, each step less a ritual and more a vow. He didn't know if what he had seen was real or the trick of a soldier's mind broken by grief. But it no longer mattered. What mattered was that he carried Daniel with him. Not just in guilt, but in honor. He turned at the far end of his path, rifle sharp against his shoulder, back ramrod straight. To anyone watching, he was still the perfect guard. But inside, something had shifted. His duty was no longer just to the unknown soldier in that tomb. It was also to Daniel, and to every ghost that walked these grounds in silence. Dawn slid into Arlington like a careful hand smoothing rumpled sheets. The air held a wash chill, and the headstones wore the tender kind of light that makes even stone look awake. Jonathan Kane stepped off the gravel path and onto the strip of grass that led to quarters, his boots damp at the seams, his pulse still riding low and steady, the way it does after a night that almost breaks you, but doesn't. He had slept barely, but the dream had remained a Pennsylvania window lit by a lamp, a letter folded to softness, rain ticking on a platform roof. Remember. Inside the barracks smelled of coffee and boot polish. Conversation ran under the clink of knives and forks like a stream under stone. He moved past it, past Harris, calling his name, past a laugh he should have recognized until a thing in him made him stop. Michael Donovan sat alone at the end of the table, a tray untouched in front of him, jaw clenched until the muscle jumped like a trapped moth. His dress blues were immaculate. He looked regulation perfect in the way only a man who felt entirely imperfect could look. Jonathan took the seat across. For a long breath, neither man said a word. The room went about its business around them. Then Michael exhaled sharply and scraped his fingers back through his hair. "You ever have a night that takes you apart piece by piece," he said quietly, "and then hands you back some of the pieces, but not the ones you thought you'd get?" Jonathan swallowed once. "Yes," Michael's laugh was small and harsh. "I saw him. I don't care if it makes me sound cracked. I saw Daniel, dress blues, saluting like he always did when he thought someone was watching." His gaze flicked up, eyes red at the edges, and Jonathan recognized the look he'd seen in mirrors after nights he didn't talk about. "I almost lost the pace." "Almost." He shook his head once, a soldier scolding himself. "I didn't. But You heard him." Jonathan said a statement, not a question. Michael blinked, thrown. "You... too..." "No," Jonathan said. "Not him." He glanced down at his hands, still and square on the table. A woman, in a raincoat. 2 nights ago on the plaza in the storm, then again by my locker. She said one word, "Remember." And for weeks now, longer, I've had a name I can't get out of my mouth unless I say it to the dark. Samuel Whitlock, World War I, Ohio. There may have been a mistake when they moved bodies back from France. He could be lying under unknown in Section 27 while his marker up in 18 is only a cenotaph. Dr. Sarah Lynn found cards, threads, a letter from Lancaster. He heard how fast he was going, reined himself in. I think the woman's tied to him somehow. I think she's why I saw anything at all. Michael leaned back, breath leaving him in a sound that wasn't quite a curse and wasn't quite prayer. For a moment he looked young enough to still be burdened with hope. "So you're hunting a name," he said. "And I'm being hunted by one." A muscle jumped under his eye. "Let's not tell Hayes we use the word hunted in here." "Captain Hayes knows more words for it than we do," Jonathan said, and they both almost smiled. It sat between them a second, small and human, before the weight found them again. Harris clattered down a plate at their elbows, toast, scrambled eggs, bacon cooling in the air, and didn't move away. "Whatever you two are not saying out loud," he murmured. "Say it somewhere with fewer ears." He held up both hands. "Not a rat, just not an idiot." Jonathan drew a breath that went farther down than the last. "The archives," he said to Michael. "Sarah's there now. She's looking for descendants. Lancaster Ashby, a sister named Martha. If we can find a living name to speak back to the dead one. If we can put someone who loved him in front of the right stone, maybe the ground will settle." Michael's throat worked. When he spoke, it scraped. "And if it doesn't?" Then Jonathan said, feeling the hard truth slide into place, "We keep standing." They walked together beneath a sky the color of milk, the cold biting cleanly at their faces. The administration building took them in with its bright warmth and smell of old paper. Dr. Sarah Lynn came out from the back with her sleeves pushed to her elbows and a pencil stuck in the crimp of her hair. She took in both men at a glance. Whatever stood between their silence and their posture, she recognized its shape. "I was about to send someone for you," she said without greeting. The Red Cross thread paid out a bit. She led them to the reading room where the winter light fell across the table like a blade. On the blotter sat a tidy stack of photocopies, a map and a photograph of a woman in a high-necked dress beside a train platform, her face not pretty, but clear and alive. "Mrs. Eliza Ashby Lancaster," Sarah said, tapping the picture. Her letter spoke of a sister, Martha Whitlock. "I found a Lancaster County record. Martha married a man named Caleb Vines in 1924. 2 children, Ruth and Joseph. Ruth married into a family that moved to Maryland. There's a Ruth Vines Carter in Annapolis who would be just past 80 if she's still living." She slid a thin folder toward Jonathan. His hands didn't reach for it. They hovered above it as if touching the paper would make the thing turn real in a way he wasn't yet ready to handle. Sarah softened. "I can make the call," she said. "You don't need to push this rock uphill alone." He nodded, grateful in a way that made him ache. "Will you—" "Of course," she said, like "of course" was the only answer she ever gives to the dead. Michael stood a half step off the table, shoulders, drawing their own map of a man who had slept on gravel and understood the geometry of loss. His voice was almost careful. "Dr. Lynn, do you—" He stopped, swallowed. "Have you ever heard of a guard seeing someone he lost in a war that isn't the one we're researching?" Sarah's eyes flicked to him. She took the measure of the lines around his mouth, the new reckoning there. Unofficially, "Yes," she said, "often enough to be more than imagination and less than policy. The Hill is a choir," someone once told me, "and a courtroom. It will sing to you. It will put you on the stand. It will also, if you let it, hand down mercy in the form of meaning. A beat. Who did you see?" My brother Michael said simply, "I left him where he fell and never forgave myself for being the one who could walk away." He lifted his chin, jaw set. "He saluted me last night." Sarah's hand flattened against the table as if the wood needed anchoring. "Then you're in the right place," she said. "Not just here. With him." She didn't meet his eyes when she added gently, "We can draw a line around Whitlock and still let Daniel stand inside it." Jonathan felt the room tilt again the way it does when a thing in you that's been standing on one leg finds the other. The folder in front of him suddenly weighed nothing. Tonight he said, looking from Sarah to Michael, "Section 27, off duty. Not as a show. The word wouldn't come." His throat closed around it as if words knew when they were not big enough. A reading Sarah supplied, saving him from the reach. A name said in the exact place the bones rest, if they rest there. A letter read aloud so the page becomes a voice. It's not ritual by regulation, but it's older than that type of rule. It's also bending, Michael said cautiously, glancing toward the window, toward the slope where the tomb sat. "Captain Hayes is a spine with a woman built around it. She won't love the idea." Then Ask Jonathan said, "Nothing about this should feel stolen." They asked. Captain Eleanor Hayes listened behind her desk without interrupting, hands folded on a blotter clean enough to shame a chapel. It took Jonathan a second to understand that the quiet wasn't dismissal, it was concentration. Her eyes cut to each of them in turn as they laid it out, the records, the dreams, the rain-soaked woman, the ghost that saluted the Section 27 unknowns, the name Whitlock looping back like a refrain that has decided to outlast the song. When they finished, she let silence stand a moment longer, then drew a careful breath. "I cannot endorse superstition," she began, and something in both their chests sank a notch. "But I will not punish reverence." She tapped one nail once against the blotter, a metronome finding a beat. "You will not wear the uniform if you go. You will not carry a weapon real or symbolic. You will not turn this into a spectacle for phones. You will go as men. If any person outside your number is to attend, she will hold credentials sufficient to keep security out of my hair." Her gaze slid to Sarah and softened by a molecule. "You will be present." "Dr. Lynn." "I will," Sarah said. Hayes's eyes flicked back to the men. Something in her face eased, not enough to make her look less like command, but enough to make her look human inside it. "I have," she said, voice lower, "stood my own kind of reading in that section. You will find that the ground is old and honest there. Be honest with it. If you hear anything you cannot carry, bring it to me and I will carry some. That is an order." She looked at the map on the wall, at nothing, at something else entirely. Dismissed. They walked out with their backs a fraction straighter, not because a superior had told them to, but because she had told them she would share the weight. Harris waited by the door, eyebrows up. "Well," he asked. "We're not fired," Michael said. It was almost a joke. Yet Harris added and clapped his shoulder. Dusk folded the sky into a darker blue. The three of them met at the break in the fence line, where the pathway turned down towards Section 27. Jonathan, in a dark coat, Michael, in a sweater and plain trousers, Sarah, with a messenger bag packed with thin sheaves and a small battery lantern half tucked inside. No one spoke. Their breath rose in soft white threads. The world held them like a held note. They found the row by the lightning-scarred tree Jonathan had dreamed. A string of tablets stamped with the single plain word, "Unknown." He had the sudden fierce impulse to apologize to each one in turn, to say, "We are late. We are sorry. We are here now." He swallowed it and took his place. Sarah set the lantern on the ground. Its glow was gentle yellow, like kitchen light through a farmhouse window. She took out a sheet and handed it to Jonathan. "Chaplain Meacham's note, as much as ink let us keep," she said. "And this—" She passed another page, a copy of the Ashby letter, its edges soft with age, even in reproduction. "You read if you can." Jonathan's throat went tight. He looked to Michael. Michael nodded once, a soldier's go-ahead. Jonathan lifted the paper. The first words snagged in his chest and found their way out anyway, a voice steadier than he felt. "Provit wit. Courage in advance, last seen carrying message under fire toward Bois de Promise, made to mother to be home by Christmas." He let that one break him open. He didn't hide it. He read the Ashby letter like a man reading a prayer across a table to the one person in a room who knows what the prayer costs. When he said Lancaster, the air seemed to lean closer. When he said Martha, the lantern flickered and steadied. Michael stepped forward without being asked. He pulled something from his pocket, a scrap of paper that had lived there a long while. "Daniel's first letter from the sand," he said, not quite trusting his voice. He wrote, "If I don't come home, don't let home forget me." His laugh creased and failed. He always hated how dramatic he sounded, but he meant it. "I didn't forget. I forgot how to remember without bleeding." "Say his name," Sarah said, like benediction. Michael did. It shook loose something that had calcified in him. The night accepted it without argument. That was when the wind changed. It came low, then higher, then low again. Not a gust, not a trick of the hill. A movement like breath shared by many lungs. The branches above them sighed. The lantern flame wavered and returned. Jonathan felt a pressure the size of a hand settle over his sternum, warm, as if a body had stood close. He did not look around to beg for proof outside himself. He let the thing be true for him, and no one else if that was how it had to be. At the edge of the row, not where the lantern lit, a dimness thickened. It had the height and width of a human being and none of the hard edges of the living. It did not show a face. It didn't have to. Jonathan felt the word before he heard it. Remember breathed again, not as command now, but as confirmation. He lifted his palm halfway, as you do when someone you love is leaving through a door you cannot follow, and you still want them to know you saw them go. Michael's shoulders eased by a quarter-inch, the tiniest surrender. He whispered, "Thank you to the empty air," and it didn't feel empty. They stood a long while. No crowd, no phones. Just the three of them and the long reach of those who had gone before, the kind of company that doesn't require talking to be conversation. When at last the cold found the part of them that wasn't warmed by what they'd called down, Sarah folded the papers and tucked them away. "I'll call Annapolis in the morning," she said softly. "If Ruth Carter answers, I'll ask her for permission for presents." Jonathan nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Michael pulled his sweater tighter at the wrists, hands finally steady. Together they walked back up the slope. The hill seemed steeper going, as if the earth had leaned down to listen and was leaning back now, satisfied. Near the top, under a lamplight that made everything look a little more ordinary than it had, a minute before Captain Hayes stepped from the shadow of a cedar. She had her coat collar turned up and her cap in her hand. She said nothing for a long second, as if measuring not just what she saw, but what the ground itself told her had just happened. "Clean," she said finally, approval in her language. "Yes, ma'am," Jonathan said. Hayes's gaze flicked to Michael. Something understanding passed through the steel. "You'll stand better tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "And you," she said to Sarah, softer. "Keep your ledger. The hill keeps one too. Sometimes the pages line up." She glanced toward the dark where Section 27 lay. When she looked back, the corners of her mouth had almost remembered how to turn up. Dismissed. They broke apart at the path, each taking a different line back to the ordinary. Above them, the tomb held its silence choir and courtroom both. Below, the older stones lay in their rows like a prayer someone had finally started to say out loud. And in the narrow space between the two, where men walk with rifles and women carry folders full of stubborn names, the wind moved soft as breath and felt like an answer. The hour was late, the air at Arlington chilled and still, and yet the crowd lingered as though bound by an invisible thread. Sergeant Daniel Hayes stood in the solemn silence, his rifle balanced across his shoulder, his boots squared into the earth as if roots had grown beneath him. But inside, something unraveled. He had seen the figure again. Not the faint wisp of smoke, not the trick of a flickering lamp, but a woman in full clarity, her uniform sharp, her eyes sorrowful, her hand raised in salute. A ghost, and yet too human to deny. Daniel's breath had caught when her gaze met his, if only for a second. The familiar ache of recognition surged. He had known her once, Lieutenant Caroline Brooks, a medic, who never returned from Afghanistan. They'd spoken on the tarmac before her last mission. She had laughed about the desert heat, teased him about his stiff posture. He remembered promising her a coffee when she came back. She never did. Her name was etched now into the white stone only yards away. And yet she stood here in spectral silence, as though waiting for something only he could give. He tried to hold his bearing to remain the immovable sentinel the world expected, but his mind spun with whispers of duty and grief. Why now, he wondered. Why her? His heart pounded like a muffled drum. The air pressed heavy, and for the first time in years, the rhythm of his ceremonial steps faltered. From the sidelines, tourists noticed. A boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad?" He stopped, the child whispered. The father frowned, puzzled, for tomb guards never wavered. Not for rain, not for fire, not for distraction. Yet Daniel's eyes were locked on the unseen. To him, the crowd blurred sound dulled until only the apparition filled his vision. The ghost stepped closer, her lips parting. Though no one else seemed to hear, Daniel caught the faintest breath. "Don't forget." The words sliced through him. He felt his throat tighten, memories flooding the names, the faces the soldiers carried off planes beneath folded flags. Caroline among them. He blinked, and suddenly the apparition faded like mist. But the echo lingered. "Don't forget." Daniel steadied himself, resumed his measured march, each step like a penance. Yet now the crowd leaned forward, sensing something larger than ceremony. They didn't know what he had seen, but they saw the tremor in his jaw, the fire in his eyes. This was no performance. It was raw, unguarded humanity. When the guard change concluded, Daniel retreated to the quiet barracks, the flickering fluorescent light doing little to settle him. He sat on the narrow bunk helmet resting on his lap. His fellow guard, Private Miller, glanced at him. "You all right, Sarge? You looked off out there." Daniel hesitated. How could he explain "just tired"? He muttered. But even as he said it, his hands trembled, betraying him. Miller shrugged, sensing more but knowing better than to pry. Silence reclaimed the room. That night Daniel couldn't sleep. He rose, walked back to the plaza, alone under the silver wash of moonlight. The marble stones gleamed, names etched into eternity. He stopped before Caroline's grave. His chest ached as he whispered, "I didn't forget. I never could." The wind stirred cold yet strangely tender, brushing against his cheek as though in reply. Behind him, footsteps sounded. He turned sharply, expecting another guard, but found instead an old man leaning on a cane, watching with somber eyes. His cap bore the insignia of the 82nd Airborne, faded and frayed. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" the veteran said, voice gravelly with years. Daniel stiffened, caught between duty and vulnerability. "You shouldn't be here this late," Daniel said quietly, trying to hold the formality. The man smiled faintly. "Neither should ghosts." "But they come anyway." Daniel's breath hitched. Had the stranger seen too? The old man tapped his cane against the ground. "I fought in Vietnam. My buddy. He still visits me sometimes. In dreams, in shadows. Reminds me not to forget. That's the burden we carry, son. And maybe the blessing." Daniel swallowed hard. The man's words cut close, as if spoken directly into the wound in his soul. "Do you believe they want something from us?" he asked. The veteran's gaze lingered on the glowing headstones. "They just want to be remembered. That's all any of us want in the end." The two stood in silence, separated by decades, yet bound by the same weight. The moonlight carved their profiles into silver relief. And Daniel realized his role wasn't just guarding the tomb. It was bearing witness to the unseen, carrying memory like a flame no storm could extinguish. When he finally turned back to barracks, he walked taller, steadier, though tears still shimmered at the corners of his eyes. The next shift awaited, and with it the discipline of ritual. But inside, something irreversible had shifted. The ghost was not gone, nor was the message. "Don't forget." And Daniel knew he wouldn't. As dawn painted the horizon, the crowd gathered again. Children, veterans, tourists, all waiting for the silent steps of the sentinel. Daniel took his post-rifle gleaming eyes fixed forward, and though no one else saw her in his mind's eye, Caroline walked beside him, unbroken, eternal. By mid-morning, the hill had the clear-rinsed look of a place that had cried and wiped its face. The amphitheater's white ribs held a pale sky. The flag tugged once, twice, then settled. Jonathan checked his phone for the fourth time before admitting he was stalling. The note from Dr. Sarah Lynn was simple. "Found a number for Ruth Vines Carter in Annapolis. I'll place the call from the archives at 0900. If she answers, you should hear her say yes." He read it again as if the words might change while he wasn't looking. Michael found him at the edge of the path, hands shoved into the pockets of a plain wool coat. Jaw dark with a shave he hadn't let himself finish. "You look like a man waiting on a verdict," he said. "I am," Jonathan answered. They walked together toward the small brick building where the paper world kept trying to keep pace with the bone one. Sarah was already there, sleeves rolled pencil tucked into the coil of her hair, the phone set on speaker atop a blotter she'd cleared like a runway. "I'll do the introducing," she said softly, "and if I need to take it off speaker, I will." Breathe. He did like it was an order. The first ring felt like a drum in a far room. The second felt closer. On the third, a voice reedy with age but bright came over the line. "This is Ruth, Mrs. Carter." Sarah said that particular gentleness she saved for the living who held a thread to the dead. "My name is Dr. Sarah Lynn. I'm calling from Arlington National Cemetery. I believe you may be related to a World War I soldier named Samuel Whitlock." Ruth finished for her, a sound like a smile tucked in a sigh. "My great-uncle. We never knew where he ended up." The rhythm of her breath changed as if she'd sat down without meaning to. "We were told different things at different times. My mother, Martha's daughter, said her mother always believed he came home the long way round through a storm." A pause. "Why are you calling now?" Sarah glanced at Jonathan and Michael and went on. "We are trying to reconcile records that don't agree. There's a marker in Section 18. There is also an unknown in Section 27 with effects that suggest a Sam Whittle. We cannot yet prove, but we are listening." She hesitated. "A tomb guard too have felt the hill ask for this." Ruth made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, the way those two often share a door. "The hill always asks," she said. "When I was a girl, my grandmother used to sit on the porch during summer storms in her slicker with a hood like a bell and say, 'If Samuel comes back, he'll come wet.'" Another breath. "I have his mother's letters, Eliza Ashby, and a photograph. He was a child with a man's mouth. As she said it, you could see him, boy and man, stitched into one body the way war does the stitching." "Would you be willing to meet us today?" Sarah asked. If you're comfortable, we could drive to you, or you to us. I don't drive the bridge anymore, Ruth said matter of fact, but I can make coffee, and I've carried these papers long enough. A rustle came through the line, the particular music of old envelopes. Come. You'll recognize us. We look like people who have been waiting. They were on the road within the hour, in a government sedan that had the smell of vinyl and the ghost of someone else's cologne. Annapolis received them with winter light and the polite hush of a town that wears its history like a good coat. Ruth's little house sat 3 turns off a narrow street, clapboard paint, the color of old milk, a brass knocker rubbed bright by years of hands. She opened the door before they knocked, small and straight-backed, a cardigan buttoned wrong at the 3rd button. When she smiled, her face made new lines to hold it. Come in, she said, as if they'd been there yesterday. You're cold. Sit. She pointed at a sofa with a crocheted blanket thrown over one arm, then bypassed the kitchen and went straight to a low chest under the window. When she lifted the lid, the smell rose, the talc-dry scent of old paper and camphor, and a hint of cedar from a block someone had tucked in years ago, believing it could keep time from chewing through. These are Eliza's, she said, laying out letters tied with faded blue ribbon. And these are the ones we think Samuel wrote before the mud took the ink. She touched the corner of a photograph with 2 fingers as if it were someone's cheek. Here he is. Jonathan leaned forward without touching. A young man in wool stood at a studio rail, chin set. Eyes not fierce so much as decided. He had the kind of face that remembers wind. The uniform tugged at Jonathan's sight, the puttees neat as a promise, the coat fitted, and a little too big across the shoulders, the way boys' coats are when they outgrow themselves faster than their mothers can hem. On the back, Ruth said, turning it carefully, someone wrote Sam Witt, and then the pen went like it had run through a puddle and came back different. She looked up, meeting Jonathan's gaze, measuring something in him and accepting it. He used to walk my grandmother to the station when the weather was bad. She wore his coat if she forgot hers. That's why we tell the story like we do. Sometimes a woman in a storm is the whole world in a picture frame. He felt the air shift in his chest at that rain, and a hood, and a woman at the edge of the Tomb Plaza looking at him like she'd been waiting for his name. I've seen her, he said, before he knew he would. I think she's why I'm standing here. Ruth's eyes didn't widen because people who have lived long with mystery don't waste surprise on confirmation. Then she found the right pair of boots, she said softly. Michael stood back, hands folded the way a man does, who knows to make room for another story, while his own leans against the wall and listens. When Ruth slid a little note free of an envelope and set it on the coffee table, the 3 of them bent over it like men at a fire. The paper was worn thin in the creases, lines going silver where it had been folded and unfolded by hands that needed to hold a thing that could be held. The writing started bold and narrowed where the pen chased the last of the ink, Ma, don't fret. The chaplain says there's to be music when we go up again. Home by Christmas. Save me a slice of persimmon. It broke off where a stain like a thumbprint darkened it. Can we? Jonathan began and had to clear his throat. May we copy these? They're yours to carry until this is done, Ruth said. I kept them long enough. But bring them back when you've laid his name where it belongs. She looked at him with that way the old sometimes have, of seeing past rank and uniform and into the story itself. You'll do it clean. We will, he said, feeling the vow take position under his ribs. They sat another hour with the letters and the photograph in one of those quiets that isn't empty. Ruth told them stories that weren't really stories so much as the beads of a life on a string. How Martha could gut a trout without cussing. How Eliza sang a hymn while she scrubbed the porch. How a coat hung by the door through 3 winters because someone might need it still. When she rose to make coffee, Jonathan stood and drifted toward the hallway, where a mirror had been hung too low by a man whose eyes had been younger when he'd hammered the nail. In the ripple of glass, just for a second, water moved across a slicker's shoulders, and white breath lifted over a mouth he knew by heart by now. The vision didn't frighten him. It steadied him the way a hand on one's back steadies you when you're about to go up a dark stair. I'm here, he said, not out loud. On the way out, Ruth pressed 2 things into Sarah's hands, the photograph and a single dried violet pressed in wax paper. We kept our dead in flowers when we didn't have stone yet, she said. Take one with you for the place that has too much stone. Back on the hill, the afternoon sun had gone thin and white, the kind of light that makes breath look like writing. Sarah disappeared into the archives with the photograph. Jonathan and Michael went straight to Captain Hayes. She listened standing, arms folded, eyes narrowed as if bracing against wind that hadn't come yet. When they finished, she tipped her chin. "You'll log the chain of custody on those papers," she said, practical first, because practical keeps the center from giving, then softer. "We'll need an authorization if you want to carve anything into what's already been set." She looked out the window at the tomb's corner and the slice of sky beyond. "Colonel Ellison has the kind of clearance that makes things move. I'll call him." Colonel James Ellison came in at dusk looking exactly like a man whose signature could turn a wall into a door if you explained the wall politely enough. He didn't waste their time. "Here's what I can do," he said, laying a folder on Hayes's desk that was thicker than the one they'd started with. "A provisional amendment to the record pending further documentary evidence. A joint inscription name acknowledged on the Section 18 stone, and a plaque at Section 27 noting believed to be interred among the unknowns. No exhumation without DNA and family consent. If the family wants DNA, we go to a different level." He tapped the folder. "Mrs. Carter's consent to memorialization will suffice for the plaque." "You have it." "We have her blessing," Sarah said. "And her faith." Ellison's eyes warmed by a degree. Faith has been known to carry weight up here. Hayes watched Jonathan the way a mechanic watches a machine run smooth after changing out the part that had been threatening to seize. "You'll plan the reading," she said. "Official enough to keep the papers from accusing us of witchcraft, unofficial enough to let whatever needs saying be said. Tomorrow at 1900 after the brigades have gone and before the city remembers noise. Invite Mrs. Carter if she can manage it. Keep it small," Ma'am Jonathan said, and the word felt like a promise signed in ink and breath. That night he walked Section 27 again, but not alone. Michael on his right, Sarah on his left, the scent of old paper on her coat still faint as dust. He set the photograph on the low lip of a stone stamped unknown U.S. soldier and stood back. The wind came up, then sank. He felt the familiar pressure over his sternum, warm, now not heavy. When he closed his eyes, a platform roof ticked under rain. A woman in a slicker lifted her face as if to say, "Go on." There was one more call to make, and the weight of it surprised him the way bodies remember who taught them to stand, even after the teacher leaves the room. He found a corner of the barracks where the noise didn't reach and dialed the number he'd typed and erased a dozen times in the last week. It rang twice. His father answered on the third voice, rough with sleep or with a kind of waking that doesn't come from beds. Dad Jonathan said, "Son, I think I know why you always stood when they read the names he said, and then nothing else would come for a second because the line between past and present had turned into a seam you could run your finger along. Tomorrow," he managed. "We're going to say one of them in the right place." On the other end, a long breath, and then the smallest sound like a man setting down a pack he hadn't admitted he was carrying. "I'll be there," his father said. "If you'll have me." He swallowed the ache. Always. When he stepped back into the corridor, the barracks seemed narrower and somehow kinder. Harris passed by and nudged him with a shoulder. "You look like a man who got married to an idea." "Same difference," Jonathan said, and smiled without irony this time. Before lights out, he wrote the order of the reading in his cleanest hand, Ruth's photograph placed. Ashby's letter read, "Chaplain." Meacham's note, the name spoken. Silence held plaque, promised. At the bottom he added 4 words he hadn't written since basic. "No one stands alone. He slept as men sleep the night before something is set right. He dreamed not of rain, but of a door opening and a coat lifted from a hook and someone stepping in from the weather to lay a hand on a table that had been waiting for years. In the morning, the hill would be the same to anyone who hadn't listened. To those who had it would be new." Outside, the tomb held on to its quiet like a covenant. Down the slope, the unknowns waited, rows aligned like measures on a staff. Somewhere between them, a boy with a man's mouth had already turned his face toward the sound of his own name coming home. The wind curled cold fingers through the marble corridors of Arlington that night, rattling the leaves still clinging to the oaks. Jonathan stood rigid at his post, but his mind was anything but still. The apparition he had glimpsed near the eternal flame, the silhouette of a soldier in full dress fading like smoke, had unsettled him far more than the bitter wind. He had sworn to himself that what he saw was not fatigue, not imagination. He had trained too long to dismiss what his eyes reported. His body remained locked in perfect alignment, rifle held with ceremonial exactness, but behind his expressionless mask his thoughts twisted with unease. Who was he? Jonathan's heart whispered in time with the cadence of his measured steps. Why here? Why now? The tomb was silent, yet the silence felt charged. Every crunch of gravel beneath Jonathan's heels seemed amplified, as though the very ground demanded his attention. He thought of the veterans who sometimes visited old men bent with age, eyes shining with memories. They came to pay respects to brothers who never came home. But this had been no visitor. His mind flicked back to his childhood. He remembered his father's hushed stories of comrades lost overseas, the weight in his voice when he spoke of those whose names would never be carved into stone because they were missing their fates unresolved. Lost but not forgotten, his father always said. And suddenly Jonathan wondered, had he just hours earlier laid eyes on one of those lost souls? A sound broke his reverie. It was faint but sharp, a metallic clink like a boot striking stone. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He pivoted with military precision, eyes sweeping the grounds. Nothing moved, but the hairs on his neck rose stiff as bristles. "Show yourself," he whispered under his breath. Words meant for no audience but the restless night. No answer. Just the distant hum of the city muted beyond the cemetery walls. Then impossibly, there it was again, the figure. Closer this time. Standing just at the edge of the walkway where the light from the eternal flame bled into shadow. The man's posture was unmistakable. A soldier at ease, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back. But his face... Jonathan's breath caught. The man's eyes glowed faintly, not with malice, but with a sorrow so deep it seemed older than the stones around them. His jawline, strong and familiar, reminded Jonathan of the old black and white photographs lining the halls of the guard quarters, faces of men who had once carried the same duty decades past. Jonathan's hand clenched the stock of his rifle, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of what unfolded before him. "Who are you?" The words slipped from his lips before discipline could stop them. His voice was soft, almost reverent. The soldier didn't speak. He only raised one arm slowly, deliberately, and pointed. Jonathan followed the line of his hand. Across the plaza in the far shadows near the gates, something gleamed faintly. A small metallic shine half buried near the base of a marble column. Jonathan's throat dried. He turned back. The figure was gone. Only the wind remained tugging at his coat, whistling through the expanse of stone and silence. For the first time in years, Jonathan broke protocol. His boots shifted off their strict pacing line. He approached the column where the ghostly finger had directed him. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, his chest tight with anticipation. When he reached the base, he crouched. His gloved hand brushed away a thin layer of dirt. His fingers closed around cold metal. It was a dog tag. He froze, staring at the name etched into the worn surface. The letters blurred as his breath fogged the metal, but when he wiped it clean, he read the inscription clearly. A name, a serial number, blood type. And Jonathan knew that name. It was the same one his father had whispered with grief during his stories of the men who never made it back. His father's best friend. A man who had vanished in combat, listed as missing in action decades ago. Jonathan's vision blurred, but not from the cold. Tears welled stinging against the freezing air. He clenched the tag tightly, as though it might vanish if he let go. The tomb behind him seemed to glow brighter, the eternal flame flickering higher. For the first time, Jonathan felt as if the dead themselves were reaching out, bridging the gulf of time in silence to deliver something only he could bear witness to. A voice, whether in his mind or carried by the wind, brushed his ear. "Take it home." Jonathan straightened, chest heaving, the tag pressed into his palm. The moon slid free of a passing cloud, bathing the plaza in silver light. He looked once more across the grounds, half hoping to see the figure again. But only the stillness of Arlington remained, and yet Jonathan no longer felt alone. He resumed his post-rifle steady expression, composed. But within him something had shifted forever. He was no longer just guarding a tomb of unknowns. He was carrying a message, an unfinished story that had chosen him as its witness. Far off, a bell tolled the midnight hour. Jonathan's grip on the tag tightened. He whispered under his breath a vow meant only for the listening dead. "I'll finish what you couldn't. I'll carry this to where it belongs." The flame crackled, answering with its eternal reply. Jonathan knew the coming days would test him in ways he couldn't yet grasp. But the moment had bound him irrevocably to a promise one forged not by the living, but by a ghost who refused to be forgotten. The cemetery was quiet again, yet Jonathan's heart was far from calm. He stood at his post, shoes aligned perfectly with the marble walkway, rifle resting against his shoulder, eyes forward. And yet the echo of that apparition, the ghost that had stared back at him with a sorrow both unbearable and familiar, would not leave him. It clung to him with every breath. He could still see the glint in those eyes, the hollow weight of a man who carried not just his own death, but the burdens of generations. Rain had begun to fall in light sheets, dotting his uniform, running down his neck in icy rivulets. Each drop only sharpened the memory. The world around him blurred into shades of gray, the headstones like silent witnesses, and he wondered if he was still sane. But then he heard the faintest whisper, "Stand, proud son." A chill tore through him. It was not his imagination this time. The voice was distinct as though carried by the wind itself. He did not move a muscle, but inside his soul trembled. "Guard, are you steady?" the relief commander asked quietly from behind. "Yes, sir." Jonathan replied, his voice crisp, though it masked the storm within. Hours later, when his shift ended, Jonathan remained by the tomb even after protocol dictated he could leave. He walked slowly among the graves, boots sinking into the damp earth, his breath visible in the misty air. He traced his fingers along the names etched in stone, feeling the grooves as though the soldiers could speak through the granite. He paused at one, reading the letters out loud. Michael Hargrove. Vietnam, 1968. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he swore he saw a shadow leaning against the tree line, a figure watching him silently. Jonathan clenched his jaw, refusing to falter. "Show yourself," he muttered. His voice cracked in defiance, half command, half plea. The wind stirred, the leaves whispered back, and then he saw it. The ghost again, not menacing but mournful, standing a few yards away in full uniform from another era, his chest riddled with invisible wounds. Jonathan's hand twitched near his rifle, but he didn't lift it. Instead, he stepped closer. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure said nothing at first, then his lips parted and the words reached Jonathan as if carved into his heart. "We never left." Jonathan staggered back, his boots scraping against stone. He wanted to run, to shout, but something held him rooted. The ghost's face was weary, a face that could belong to any soldier from any war. And yet there was something personal in his eyes, a recognition. Jonathan's throat tightened. "Why me?" he whispered. "Because you still listen," the ghost said, and then like smoke carried away by the breeze, he vanished. Jonathan stood alone, shaking his hands numb, his heart pounding like a drum. He turned toward the tomb once more, and in that instant he understood. The silence he guarded was not empty. It was full alive with the presence of those who had gone before. Every step he took, every shift he stood, he was not alone. The ghosts were there, walking beside him. When he returned to the barracks, his fellow guards noticed his pallor. "You look like you saw a ghost," one joked. Jonathan didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the floor, his reflection rippling in a puddle of rainwater that had followed him in. In that reflection, just for a flicker of a second, another face appeared behind his own. A soldier's face. A face that smiled faintly with something like pride. And Jonathan knew then that his life had shifted forever, that guarding the tomb was no longer duty alone. It was communion with the fallen, a vow renewed not in silence, but in shared memory. The night stretched long, heavy with meaning. Jonathan lay awake, listening for whispers in the dark, waiting for the moment when the silence broke again, not with fear, but with truth. He realized he would never look at his post the same way. And he feared, too, that this was only the beginning. By 6:30, the sky above Arlington had the blue-to-black gradient of a bruise healing. A thin, clean cold rode the air. Jonathan Kane buttoned his plain dark coat with hands that looked steady and felt anything but. No dress blues tonight? Captain Hayes's terms had been clear. Men, not statues. He checked the inner pocket where the photocopy of Eliza Ashby's letter lived beside the dried violet Ruth had pressed into Sarah's hand. The paper felt like a small, warm animal. The flower felt like breath saved for later. Down the slope, Section 27 waited. Even in twilight, those tablets had a way of making time tell the truth. Jonathan's phone buzzed once, a text from Sarah. "We're here. Ruth with me. Lantern ready. Colonel on his way with Hayes." He typed on foot 2 minutes and slid the phone away, suddenly ashamed of the modern thing in his palm. Tonight deserved older tools, names, breath hands. Footfalls drew alongside. Michael Donovan matched his pace without a word. No uniform for him either, just a sweater under a peacoat jaw, freshly shaved knuckles unscabbed for once. Between them hung the comfortable quiet of men who had said the heavy part already. Michael's gaze tracked the slope, then flicked to Jonathan. "You gonna be okay?" he asked. "No," Jonathan said honestly. "But I'm going anyway." Michael's mouth tipped. That's the definition of okay up here. They turned at the path break and saw the little gathering come into focus the way a picture sharpens underwater. Dr. Sarah Lynn stood with her messenger bag and the battery lantern tucked low at her feet, its glow the color of kitchen light on a winter morning. Beside her, Ruth Vine's Carter cardigan buttoned wrong again. This time on purpose, Jonathan suspected held a small tin the size of a sandwich box. She lifted it when she saw him. For him, she said, "Persimmon cookies. I know he can't eat them, but sometimes food remembers better than people do." Jonathan didn't trust his voice. He bowed his head a salute sideways. "Thank you, ma'am." Captain Eleanor Hayes arrived on the minute coat collar, up cap in hand, the air around her calmer for her standing in it. Colonel James Ellison appeared with 2 staffers and a slim black portfolio. He shook Ruth's hand with both of his. "Mrs. Carter," he said warmly, "on behalf of, well, all of us, thank you for letting us carry your family's name a little way." Ruth squeezed back, bones bird-light and strong. "Don't drop it," she said. It wasn't a threat. It was the oldest favor. Jonathan scanned the shadows. One figure stood apart, posture familiar, though no uniform marked him. His father, hands in pockets, shoulders square in that particular way. Men keep themselves upright when a church bell sounds. Their eyes met, and something long and complicated crossed the space between them, like a bridge being thrown plank by plank. Jonathan stepped close, and his father spared him the awkwardness of choice by reaching first. The hug was brief and tight, the kind fathers and sons use when they're not sure how to say, "I'm glad it's you." "You look like you," his father said, which was his way of saying, "I'm proud." Jonathan nodded once, which was his way of saying I needed to hear that. Hayes cleared her throat. A small sound that called the room to order even outdoors. "We'll keep this clean," she said to the circle. "No fanfare, no phones. Colonel Ellison will say what must be on paper. Dr. Lynn will read. Mr. Kane." Her eyes found him and softened by a filament. "We'll carry what he brought." She looked toward the row of stones. "And the ground will do what the ground does." They formed a crescent at the line of tablets stamped, "Unknown U.S. Soldier." Sarah set the lantern on a flat of earth and took out the photograph of the boy with the man's mouth. She placed it at the base of the central stone as carefully as a mother sets a sleeping child down. Ruth bent with her and tucked the violet beside it. Michael stood back half a pace, eyes bright, hands open at his sides, as if ready to catch a thing that might fall. Colonel Ellison opened the portfolio and read his voice the particular mix of formality and feeling that comes from a life of talking at graves, by agreement of the Office of the Secretary of the Army and the Superintendent of Arlington National Cemetery. And with the consent of the family, we acknowledge that Private Samuel J. Whitlock Company, M313th Infantry, 79th Division. United States Army, born in Ohio, died October 1918, may lie among the unknowns interred in Section 27. His name shall be inscribed on his cenotaph in Section 18 and affixed by plaque here as believed reinterred among the unknowns. We do not disturb the sleep of the dead. We disturb our records to honor the truth that sleep holds. He closed the folder. May we be as careful with the living. Silence settled. Not the thin, brittle kind that follows a speech. The full, warm kind that arrives when words have done their job and stand aside. Sarah unfolded a photocopy of the ink-run chaplain's note and read it like she had memorized the spaces where the words were missing. Private Wit, courage in advance, last seen carrying message under fire toward Bois de Promise, made to mother to be home by Christmas. She inhaled eyes on the page, then lifted the Ashby letter as if it weighed more than paper. Dear Red Cross, my sister's boy Samuel was called Whitlock by his pa, though the name wasn't made right on paper. He wrote us from France about mud up to the calf and music at the service tent. We have not had a clear answer since the armistice. We think we would know if he set foot on the porch. If there is any way to tell us where his bones rest so we can talk to them proper, tell us. I sit in my slicker when it storms because I promised his mother I would be at the station when his train comes and the train won't care about weather. Signed, Eliza Ashby Lancaster. Sarah's voice thinned on slicker and steadied. We are at the station, Mrs. Ashby, she said softly. We are at the station now. Hayes glanced at Jonathan. He understood. He stepped forward and took out his own page, the copy of the letter with the persimmon line. The paper shook once and then steadied in his hand. He heard his father's breath at his back, the way a man hears a black ice river under snow. "Ma, don't fret," he read. "The chaplain says there's to be music when we go up again. Home by Christmas. Save me a slice of persimmon." He let the silence after the last word fill with what wasn't written. "I'm sorry I tried. I wanted to keep my promise and didn't get to." He folded the page and slid it away like a man putting a photograph back in a wallet after looking long enough to make it hurt in a good way. Ruth opened the tin and took out a single cookie, pale and sugared. She set it on the grass by the stone. "For the train that did come," she said, "just not the way we hoped." Ellison nodded to a staffer who stepped forward and eased a small cloth from a bronze plaque temporarily staked into the earth. The lantern light slid over the letters and made them look wet. Private Samuel J. Whitlock, 1896 to 1918, Col UNM 313th INF, 79th Diver, U.S. Army beloved son of Ohio, beloved nephew of Lancaster, believed reinterred among the unknown dead of Section 27. Name honored also at Section 18, no one clapped. It would have been wrong. Instead, the air seemed to lean closer the way a room does when someone finally speaks the thing every heart had been holding back. A wind climbed the hill and moved through the cedars like a long, low chord. Jonathan felt it lay a hand flat over his sternum. Again. Warm this time, unambiguously. Warm. And he didn't fight it. He let the feeling travel outward into his shoulders, down his arms, into his fingertips. He lifted his palm a fraction, not a salute, not a wave, a recognition. Beside him, without being asked, Michael came to attention. He didn't snap into it the way he would on the mat. He slid into it like a man taking up a familiar instrument. His chin lifted, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He whispered so softly only the ground heard, "Hey, Danny." Then, with a precision that belonged to the dead and the living, both he raised his hand and held a salute for a count that had nothing to do with 21 and everything to do with long enough. When he lowered it, his shoulders had dropped by the width of a regret. And then they saw her. Not all of them, just enough. At the far edge where lantern light died and afterglow took over. A woman in a rain slicker stood with her hood down, hair dark with weather that wasn't falling. Her face wasn't dramatic. It was the kind you'd pass 100 times and then one day realize had been the anchor in a room. She had Eliza's cheekbones from the photograph. She had somebody else's eyes. Sam's, maybe steady and young. She lifted her hand not to wave them closer, but to point not at the tomb, not at the unknown stone, but at the plaque. Here the hand said, "Say it here, now." Sarah's mouth opened a fraction and shut. Ruth didn't gasp. She pressed her fingers to the knot of her cardigan and nodded a grandmother's acknowledgement to a weather ghost she'd been waiting on since she was a girl. Jonathan's father made a sound in his throat, like a man remembering the name of a song he loved. Jonathan spoke the name the way men say vows, Samuel J. Whitlock. The slicker woman tilted her head as if hearing a tune at last, and then the image thinned and was gone. The lantern guttered once and steadied. Somewhere down the hill, a fox barked sharp and satisfied. No bugler had been summoned. Still from the amphitheater a few hundred yards away, a single clear note lifted someone practicing at the wrong hour or the right one. It wasn't taps. It was just a scale slow as prayer. It rose and hung and fell, and in that simple climb and descent was every song about leaving and every song about home. Hayes's hands were knotted behind her back. She unclasped them. Clean, she said again, but this time the word held gratitude. Ellison tucked the portfolio under his arm and extended his hand to Ruth. We'll see the permanent plaque placed with ceremony, he promised. Not big, not small, just right. Just right, Ruth agreed. Then she looked up at Jonathan, and because age gives you courage, she reached for his face with her fingertip and tapped his cheek as if testing a loaf of bread. You walk like you know where you're going now. He smiled because for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a betrayal to. Sometimes the hill draws the map. As they turned to go, Jonathan's father fell into step beside him. They didn't speak for a dozen paces. Then his father said slow and sure, I stood for names a long time because I didn't know how to do anything else. You made one sit down in the right chair. He cleared his throat. Proud of you, son. Thank you, Jonathan said, careful with the words as if they were glass. The last thing they did was nothing on purpose. No benediction, no formal dismissal. They let the quiet have the last say. The lantern winked out at Sarah's touch. Shoes whispered on frost. The little violet looked dark as ink against the grass. The persimmon cookie sat there absurd and perfect, offering sweetness to a story that had held mostly salt. Halfway up the slope, Jonathan looked back. The bronze caught the last of the light and threw it up like a signal fire only the dead could see. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a boy in wool and puttees standing beside it, chin up, eyes decided. The figure lifted his palm once in acknowledgement, a soldier's hello to a soldier, and then the hill was only stone and grass and night again. Tomorrow, Michael said quietly, as if reminding them all. We stand the watch. We do, Jonathan answered. He felt lighter without feeling empty. The oath had not changed. Only its weight had shifted from his shoulders to its right place in the ground. The dawn that followed felt different. It came slow-filtered through a gray haze that seemed to linger longer than usual over Arlington, as though the hill itself wasn't yet ready to release the night it had just held. Jonathan woke before reveille, sitting upright in his small quarters, listening to the silence that felt fuller than it had in months. He touched his chest where the warmth had settled the night before, half expecting it to be gone. It wasn't. He shaved carefully, the scrape of the blade steady ritual more than necessity. When he pulled on his pressed blues, the fabric carried an extra gravity, as though it wasn't just uniform but inheritance. He thought of Ruth's finger tapping his cheek, of Michael's quiet salute of the plaque, catching fire from the lantern's glow, and of Sam Whitlock's name finally spoken aloud in the right place. By the time he stepped outside, Michael was already waiting on the walk, coffee steaming from a paper cup. He wore his uniform, sharp boots, mirror bright, but his eyes betrayed a night with little sleep. You look like you fought with ghosts, Jonathan said, accepting the second cup Michael handed him. Michael exhaled through his nose. Didn't fight, just sat with them. Turns out they don't need you to win, they just need you to stay. Jonathan nodded, sipping the bitter warmth. It steadied him. They walked the path in companionable silence, shoes striking frost. At the plaza, Captain Hayes already stood waiting. She wasn't facing them. Her gaze was on the marble, her cap tucked beneath her arm. The air around her was clipped and exact, but her shoulders seemed a fraction lower than usual, as though she'd let herself breathe during the night. Gentlemen, she said when they approached, voice brisk, but touched with something human. Last night wasn't a ceremony. It was an anchor. Today we do what we're sworn to. Jonathan felt the words settle into him like stones dropping into still water. Yes, ma'am. Ellison arrived not long after, dressed formally, though not in full uniform. He carried nothing in his hands this time, no folder, no notes. He seemed lighter, almost relieved. He clasped Jonathan's hand firmly. Plaques being prepped for permanent placement, he said. Family name attached now to both sections. It'll stand. Jonathan met his eyes. Thank you. Ellison held his gaze a beat. Don't thank me. Just keep walking that line. The sun finally cut through the haze, laying a blade of gold across the tomb. The guards rotated out with the precision of metronomes' rifles, snapping boots, striking marble in exact cadence. Every sound was familiar, but today it thrummed differently. Each strike felt like a heartbeat, every pivot like a promise renewed. Jonathan's turn came. He stepped forward, rifle poised, breath measured. The world funneled down to stone, shadow, and silence. He carried the rhythm in his bones, the oath in his blood. The air sharpened until it felt like he was standing inside a bell just before it rang. He pivoted, marched, pivoted again. His eyes never drifted, but his mind carried more than one presence. He felt Sam Whitlock somewhere at his side, boots crunching in a different century's mud. He felt Michael's brother Danny standing just out of sight, but close enough to borrow strength from. He felt the countless others whose names had blurred into marble. When the relief came, he clicked into stillness, every joint singing with the clarity of discipline. Hayes's nod was nearly imperceptible, but enough. Afterward, the crowd lingered longer than usual. A boy of maybe 10 stepped forward from the rope line with his father's hand on his shoulder. The boy looked up at Jonathan with a solemnity older than his years. "Sir," he said, "what do you hear when you walk?" Jonathan blinked. He hadn't expected the question. He crouched to the boy's level rifle still balanced against his shoulder. He searched for words that wouldn't betray the oath's silence, but wouldn't lie either. Finally, he said softly, "I hear footsteps. Some are mine. Some aren't." The boy nodded like he understood more than he should, and his father's eyes shone with something unsaid. They stepped back, and Jonathan stood again, feeling the weight of generations and the strange lightness that came with carrying them properly. Later, when the plaza had emptied, Hayes gathered them in the guardroom. Ruth had left a note on the table folded, once Ruth's handwriting curling like vines. "Thank you for letting Sam sit at the table. He was hungry for his name. R." Inside the fold was half a persimmon cookie wrapped in wax paper. No one touched it. They all simply let it rest there, and offering proof that some stories didn't need an ending so much as a place to pause. Michael leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "Feels different now," he admitted. "It is different," Hayes said. "But nothing about the oath has changed. What you two did last night," she let the words hang, then clipped them short. "You carried more than yourselves. Remember that when the weight comes back." Jonathan met Michael's eyes. Neither spoke, but both understood. The watch wasn't lighter, but it was clearer. That evening, Jonathan walked alone to Section 27. The plaque was still temporary lantern-gone grass, undisturbed except for the cookie Ruth had left crumbled now into a scattering of sugar and crumbs that sparrows picked at. He stood with his hands behind his back, breathing the dusk. "Private Whitlock," he said quietly, voice carrying just enough to feel like it belonged there. "Welcome home." The wind didn't answer. It didn't need to. The silence was full, and for the first time in years, Jonathan knew it wasn't empty. He turned back toward the tomb where his watch and the names waited. Night returned with its familiar hush, but it no longer pressed as heavily on Jonathan's chest. The quarters were quiet. The barracks' muted sounds softened into background rhythm. He sat on his cot, boots, polished rifle cleaned and resting on the rack, and yet his mind refused to shut down. He thought of Ruth's note, of the boy at the rope line asking what he heard when he walked, of the way the marble under his feet had felt warmer, as though it carried voices too old for him to know, but still needing him to walk for them. The next morning brought clear skies, crisp blue stretching above the white stone, and evergreen rose like a flag pulled taut. The plaza filled quickly. Veterans in faded jackets, children clinging to parents, young cadets watching with chins lifted, every eye on the tomb. Arlington seemed alive, vibrating with a current that none of them could see, but all of them could feel. Jonathan stood in the ready room, adjusting his gloves with deliberate care. Captain Hayes entered her presence, still sharp as steel, but softened now by something more human. She gave each guard a long look before speaking. "Today will be remembered," she said, her tone even, but beneath it ran a current of pride. "The Whitlock name will be inscribed on the permanent plaque this morning. You are not walking just for the unknown. You are walking for every name nearly lost and for every family waiting for their silence to be broken. Guard well." They answered as one. "Yes, ma'am." The guard detail marched out. Jonathan took his place in the rotation, feeling each muscle coil tight and release with precision. He marched pivoted, carried the rifle, but today every movement seemed connected not only to training, but to story. And when he turned, the light caught the newly placed plaque at section 27. Freshly polished brass, Whitlock's name etched deep, standing alongside the others. A permanence forged out of silence, broken. As the crowd quieted, Ruth appeared again. This time she wasn't alone. A line of Whitlock descendants, children, grandchildren, cousins, stood with her. Many clutching folded photographs or scraps of letters worn thin from decades of touch. Ruth's eyes found Jonathan's, and she gave a nod so small it might have been missed. But to him, it was a thunderclap. The chaplain stepped forward, voice rising against the hush. "Today we honor a soldier once forgotten, now named. Private Samuel Whitlock, son, brother, friend, no longer unknown." The crowd stirred. Veterans saluted. A little girl released a white balloon that spiraled upward until it vanished against the sky. Jonathan's step didn't falter, though his throat tightened. He kept his cadence, rifle sharp, breath measured, heart pounding with something that felt like release. After the ceremony, Ellison shook his hand. "It's done," he said simply. No more silence. Michael clapped Jonathan on the shoulder. "Guess the ghosts are lighter now." Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Not lighter," he replied, "but not alone anymore." That evening, as the sun burned itself out over the stones, Jonathan made one last walk. Not in the plaza, not under orders, but on the worn path through section 27. He paused at Whitlock's plaque, let the silence surround him. He whispered, "We kept it." The wind curled through the rows of markers, lifting the last of the autumn leaves, carrying them like fragments of memory. And for once, Jonathan didn't resist the weight. He embraced it. Because he finally knew duty wasn't just about silence. It was about carrying voices that could no longer speak and making sure the world remembered. And so he walked back toward the tomb, not as a man haunted, but as a guard made whole. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video.